Hello, mates. A pleasure to see you return. This is an interview with the author of one of the most incredible investigations into corruption, capital flight, and the extent of the pure degradation the offshore financial havens have upon the world. The guest's name is Jim Henry, and he is the author of Blood Bankers. I will give Jim a full bio momentarily, but first I wanted to introduce to you the theme of the podcast, of what we spoke about. There is a loosely accurate caricature of how business was conducted in the developing world during the 80s and onwards, formed by John Perkins' book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The notion that a Western firm would fly into the developing world, Brazil's Amazon, the Philippines, Mexico, Guatemala, Kinshasa, Iran, etc., and he would then propose some overinflated infrastructure project or means of public spending that would greatly benefit the developing country. Finance would be exchanged, usually with the assistance of some public aid. A fancy engineering and construction firm would be flown in. The deal would have been delivered at 3x the budget, half its capacity, and any of the money that could have otherwise been filtered through the developing society was more often than not siphoned away to a few corrupt officials who inevitably then rerouted that money offshore. And so metaphorically, this giant amount of capital would come in and then just bounce off the surface of a country and then go straight back out again, rather than come in and then satiate the company as its supposed intention was. This would then leave the developing country with wasted time, energy, and usually loss of life as well. There's many examples in Blood Bankers that Jim Henry gives of these big infrastructure projects that utilized indigenous labor in Latin America to the point where many people would die from working. But ultimately, the loose caricature is that a few get very rich and then the rest are left with nothing. There is actually no development after all. But however, like I said, this is a caricature of an explanation for what is actually going on. What Jim Henry discovered through his investigation, documented in Blood Bankers, is differing forms of the above story told through different lenses of complexity all throughout the world. His investigation takes him all through Latin America, from Venezuela to Guatemala to Brazil to Nicaragua and then down to Argentina, and across the world to the Philippines, documenting the infamous Marcos regime. In these different parts of the world, Jim discovers again and again corruption and capital flight where perennially a corrupt few manage to siphon billions of dollars in investment and aid just back to themselves, only to be rerouted into offshore accounts and lost in the impossible maze of financial secrecy. Imelda Marcos, who was the wife of the authoritarian leader for the Philippines during the 70s and 80s, to this day is rumored to have billions of dollars, which is rightly that of the Filipino people, stuffed and hidden away in some amoral bankers' hands. Blood Bankers is the investigation into the finance of all of this grubby business, a classic tale of following the money. This is coincidentally a great week to be releasing this podcast since it corresponds with the Pandora paper leak. Blood Bankers is as much an inquisition into corruption in the developing world as it is a microscope and one of the first books to highlight just how cancerous the world of offshore is on our planet. It is offshore that enables criminal organizations to scale to the heights that they do. Not firepower and not manpower, it is financial secrecy that allows this all to happen. And also, as a quick aside, do subscribe to this podcast because later in this week I'm releasing a podcast with Shaxson, a man who is probably the world's leading journalist on financial secrecy and offshore. He did a podcast with me last week exclusively about the Pandora Papers. However, needless to say, Jim Henry is a remarkable man. I was so thrilled to speak with him, and despite technology trying its very best to stifle our correspondence, we managed to ultimately record almost 4 hours. Jim is a Harvard-educated economist and lawyer, one of the famous Nader Raiders, a former chief economist at McKinsey, which for those who are unaware, has at times been one of the most powerful organizations in the world, an investigative journalist, author, and as you can imagine, much, much more as well. He's currently founder and managing director of the Sag Harbour Group, a consultancy for technology organizations. In this podcast, you can expect to hear about the following things: how Jim discovered President Nixon's offshore money, the early history of tax havens, operating as a chief economist at McKinsey during so much of the development crisis, his thoughts on Confessions of an Economic Hitman, an example of the archetypal debt elephant, which is a hydro dam in Brazil whose damage is borderline unfathomable, implications of the underground economy, debt trap diplomacy, and really so much more as well. The conversation is not as structured and linear as I would have liked, but given Jim's erudition and experience, it's tough to stick to a timeline. I think after about 30 to 40 minutes, we really got the ball rolling. So have a look at the timestamps to navigate through the chat, because the subject matter does jump around quite a bit. Personally, I think the last hour is my favorite. But interspersed throughout the chat are some of the dramatic highlights that I tease in the introduction. Drama of Brazil, attempted kidnappings, and so forth. I want to corner the podcast for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. Based off the email correspondence, this podcast has so far attracted extremely brilliant, smart, but most importantly, curious people, and I feel honored to be in such good company. Discoverability within the podcast algorithms are extremely Stone Age. There is actually one variable that matters, and that is the amount of 5-star reviews attached to a comment that your podcast has, and that is why so much crap can filter to the surface. So I please ask you that if you're keen as a bean and okay with supporting me, please do share this with a mate and pump your good juice into the algorithm. And the best way to pump your juice is with 5 stars attached to a review. I cannot overstate how helpful that would be to me. Alright, and with all of that as context, I will leave you with one final message from Jim he sent to me in anticipation of the conversation. And as you will see, it really fired me up to speak with him. And it goes as follows. This is Jim. That goddamn white whale took me nearly 2 decades to research and finally get published. I spit out a Spanish version in '96 in 2 hellish weeks in Bogota. That version is 2x the English and has a Treasure Islands prequel on the pirate banking tax haven industry, which was still just taking off. It carried me to 30 countries, only a fraction of which are in the book. I nearly got killed. Bad guys, bad roads, bad food, multiple times researching it. I lost a marriage and nearly went bankrupt, got fired after years of labor by my original editor. They thought I had miserable sales, no reviews, found out someone had made digital copies that sold tens of thousands. I never got a penny from. Many times I gave up on it and had some dedicated editor plus my own demons order me to finish the goddamn book. But I also had incredible investigative luck. I helped topple Noriega in Panama by finding 3 years of his drug deal phone records, later used in his trial. Found President Nixon's offshore accounts in Nassau, was in Beijing during Tiananmen Square protests, and then in 1996 was in Moscow during Yeltsin's election steal. I penetrated the private banking offices of a top Swiss private bank and 2 top US banks, located the offshore accounts of Marcos and Carlos Andres Perez, got hired by Paraguay's AG to locate General Stroessner's accounts in Miami, and found the Hamburg bank where JP Morgan's senior vice president for Latin America stashed loot for top Brazilian officials, etc., etc., etc. It's not a happy bragging tale. In many ways I failed. If I had to do it all over again, I would have stayed in Minnesota and stuck with farming. Boohoo. Anyway, happy to talk about any of this. I never have. And with that, here is Jim Henry. So, Mr. Jim Henry, despite the tech doing its absolute best efforts to stifle and ruin this conversation, here we are. We found ourselves together on Zoom. How are you?
Good. Great to talk to you this morning. And maybe the technical gods will be kinder. They've been fickle in the last few days, but
They have.
I spent a lot of time in the software industry, so I know the downside of technology companies.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could definitely maybe start to think that there is some grand conspiracy behind it, considering the type of stuff we're going to be speaking about, because I haven't experienced these issues beforehand, which is such a shame. But here we are. This is the second time we recorded, the first time on Saturday, as we've alluded to, the tech failed us. So I was thinking of reintroducing as we did, and then guiding through the early years, getting up to the point where you're working on a Manhattan Wall Street law firm. So with your permission, I'll start from there and we'll just kick it and roll it on.
Sure. That's great.
All right. And starting at the very beginning, like we did on Saturday, to whom, where, and when were you born?
Well, I was born in Minnesota, Minneapolis, deep in the Midwest, in 1950. And, that was a kind of an interesting place to be at that period. It was kind of a progressive state back then, and known for being not only Democrats, but it had a communist governor in the 1930s. It had a lot of Norwegians and Swedes who were had migrated and were kind of a progressive core, and a strong farm community with rural electrical cooperatives and great education systems and no particular ethnic or racial neuroses. I say partly because it was almost 99% white. But this kind of liberal tradition, I think, was important in Minnesota. Is also a tradition of activism and citizenship. And my father was elected to the school board and was active in local politics. He was a small town CPA, but he always had this idea of being a good citizen. Sort of encouraged me to be involved in politics from a very young age. So I went to public schools and never thought about private wealth or private education. It was really a good background to have if you're going to be involved in ultimately in journalism, as I became. Sure. And I think it encouraged the kind of the levels of wealth inequality that we see today, where I live in the Hamptons, which got sort of more billionaires per square inch than any place else in the United States, and this extraordinary levels of wealth inequality. Nothing like that existed in Minnesota. I mean, it was basically a middle class society, and strong democratic roots. So, I guess you could discuss forever where someone comes from or why they do what they do, but certainly that was a big influence on me. So I ended up getting a scholarship, going to Harvard, spending a long time in Cambridge, and probably too much time, but did
10 years, right?
Graduate work. This was in the 60s when everybody was involved in activism, and I worked for Ralph Nader in Washington as a Nader Raider back then. That was a formative experience, and involved in anti-war protests and civil rights stuff, and worked for the United Mine Workers for a while as an organizer in the early 70s. But this was a whole kind of prelude to jumping back to corporate America and becoming kind of a first of all a Wall Street lawyer, and then a Wall Street economist at McKinsey and Company, and became their chief economist. And along the side of all this, I continued to be an investigative kind of economist. I mean, I love to sort of bury into puzzles that I saw along the way that were empirical puzzles that were kind of unexplained by the standard economic theories. And one of them that I turned up very early in this, and sort of had a pretty long-term impact, was this notion of the global underground economy. And I stumbled on the fact when I was in graduate school that there was this kind of incredible number of $100 bills outstanding outside of banks, somehow in circulation in the economy. And, most Americans at that point had never seen a $100 bill. Today, they're more common, but back then, I think the number was something like 4 or 5 per capita. Today, it's like 30 per capita. But, the question is, where was all this currency? And I wrote an article about it that proposed that we actually do what the Allied forces had done in Germany at the end of World War II, which was to tackle the black market in Germany. They recalled currencies and had people come in and have to explain where they got these wads of bills. That proposal was out there. It was, by me. It was debated, and it set up a whole lot of interesting responses from Congress and from the administration back then. And there actually got to be, the Federal Reserve gave me a whole lot of data that they hadn't published on what we called inter-regional currency flows. And this is in 1977, 1978, when drug traffic was just starting to explode. We had Colombia starting to export a lot of cocaine to the United States. We already had marijuana coming in from Mexico. And this was associated with a lot of currency. And so it turned out that in that Federal Reserve data that I got by virtue of this article, I really came across the first hardcore evidence of, huge surpluses flowing into Florida, Texas, California banks in the form of big bills.
Mm-hmm.
And, testified in front of Congress about this. The Federal Reserve instituted limits on the amount of currency that you could turn into a bank. $10,000 back then was an awful lot of money. And so that was sort of phase one of my interest in the global underground economy, and what ultimately led to the kind of research on capital flight, blood bankers, and private banking and tax havens that I've been continuing to this day. So in many ways, I kind of wish I'd never stumbled on the $100 bill, but this was sort of actually, I think my dad was the one who pointed this out. He'd been pouring through Federal Reserve statistics for some reason. He said, "Why are there all these bills in circulation? You're the economist in the family. There must be a theory about this," and there wasn't. So.
Really? Was there very little known about this sort of cash economy and the implications of the underground economy?
It was virtually unknown. Before? I mean, there were 2 or 3 economists, including myself, at this point. I was in graduate school.
And by this point, what year is it?
This was between 1976 and 1980, 81.
So you're in your late 20s.
2 or 3 of us who were writing about the underground economy and trying to estimate the size based on relationships between the demand for currency and the observable economy that we see. And so that kind of today, it's, if you go back in the last 5 years, you see people like Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, another Harvard economist, going and proposing that we actually recall $100 bills. Well, that was in 2014. He had been Treasury Secretary with the power to do that in the late 90s, and he didn't do it. But I had this idea back in the 1970s and could get almost no one in power to actually be interested in it. I mean, I think today you see about more than $2.5 to $3 trillion of U.S. currency and other big bills like the euros in circulation, and most of that money is actually offshore. That was one of the key findings of our research, was that it wasn't within the big countries themselves. That was mainly being used in places like Argentina. Russia had enormous accumulations, just as a form of capital flight, the poor man's capital flight, to keep the mattress money as a kind of a hedge against their own weak domestic currencies. So, that was the first element of capital flight that we analyzed, was this demand for big bills. And, it was also kind of neat because, unlike ordinary economists who are sitting there building models of things and estimating equations and, sort of spending a lot of time in the armchair, I actually got up out of the armchair and went around to these Federal Reserve banks, and did some interviews with people about, so what's the problem here? And this sort of became a basic pattern of my kind of research. Many economists to this day, basically are comfortable kind of sitting back and doing theory, or if they do estimate things, they tend to run big models with lots of data on computers. But it's not more recently
undoubtedly discounting some of the most important variables.
Well, I mean, and basically, kind of doing, a sort of highly theoretical form of inquiry without engaging in basic puzzles. So the approach that I've taken and kind of encouraged other economists to take is to actually, as the great Princeton statistician John Tukey once said, just look at the fucking numbers, the interocular eye test, he said. Just look at the data, look for actual puzzles that need to be explained, and start with those. And, that has worked for me time and again. So if you roll forward, the next puzzle I kind of tackled was related to the drug traffic. And I sort of wanted to figure out, well, we see all this currency flowing into banks. Which banks are involved in this? And where are the banks? And who are these characters that we're seeing? So I ended up going to Florida in the early 80s and spending a lot of time there and looking at an institution that had been formed in Nassau called the Castle Bank and Trust. And that was one of the first offshore banks that anyone had noticed or investigated.
Interesting. Where is Nassau? Just for
Nassau in the Bahamas.
Okay. Okay. Right.
British,
so it's not a U.S. bank. It is a private offshore bank.
Not a U.S. bank, and therefore not under U.S. jurisdiction, but only 60, 80 miles off the shore, away from Florida. So this bank had been created basically by Florida lawyers and the Chicago lawyers who were either working for the CIA or for the Chicago Mafia. And their client list was this incredible list, which I got a hold of 200 of the wealthiest Americans who had put their money in offshore trusts that were illegal. And they were all located in this Nassau bank. And, so we, people like Paul Helliwell, who was a big, he was the paymaster for the Bay of Pigs. We found the Pritzker family from Chicago, with the owners of the Hyatt hotel chain, had a offshore trusts there. They kind of somehow suggested that they were connected to the Chicago crime families. Leading members of the Cleveland Mafia. Bob Guccione of Penthouse magazine. My favorite was Creedence Clearwater Revival, the rock group. They had been talked into parking their loot from their incredible career. I mean, if you listen to Creedence to this day, they're just the best.
Yeah, they are.
But they've been talked into doing a tax dodge by putting money in this offshore haven in the form of an offshore trust. So this is an example of where some of the first practitioners, some of the most advanced work on offshore havens was being done not by some shady character in the Cayman Islands or Naui or the Cook Islands. It was right there in Miami, and they were setting up these operations in places like the Bahamas and later the Cayman Islands, just because they were next door. So that was sort of phase one. And of course of that, I mean, without going into the gory details, I was able to get quite a bit of information about that bank. And there's a long story about Richard Nixon. Actually, it turns out this is a good example of the long arm of investigative stories. You never know how long it's going to take once you start on one of these tales to actually have it complete. So about 1980, I guess I was doing the research on Castle Bank and Trust. I interviewed everyone I could find who had worked at the bank, which had been closed in 1974. And one of the characters I came across was the actual treasurer for this bank, a Canadian guy. And he would not talk to me, wouldn't say boo. And he knew where all the bodies were buried because he knew he had account authorization was part of his domain. And but then he moved and retired back to I think it was Calgary. And for 30 years, I didn't hear from him. And I kept every 2 or 3 years, I'd say, "Are you ready to talk?" This is an old story. All these people have died. Nobody's going to come after you.
Yeah.
Richard Nixon is gone. Can you confirm this unconfirmed report? I had interviewed the IRS had actually done a good thing. They had hired a private investigator named Norman Casper. Norman had managed to seduce the president of this bank when he was on a trip to Miami with a lady friend They went out on a date. Norman broke into the guy's briefcase and got a complete list of all of these clients. And the next thing that happened, that was about 1973, was that President Nixon was still in power. He decided to fire the head of the IRS, to cancel this investigation, and to name a new IRS commissioner from Cleveland, who promptly closed the whole thing down. So Norman had told me, you've got to look closer at this bank. This is, Nixon had accounts there. I can't prove it. It wasn't just organized crime. It wasn't just, sort of CIA types. It was, the president of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a huge story. Last year, he finally decided to say, I can confirm that Mr. Nixon had at least 2 accounts at the Nassau branch of Castle Bank and Trust.
Nice.
While he was there. So we still don't have documentary evidence of that. Documentation is nice. Probably doesn't exist anymore. But at least this fellow was in a position to know there's no reason to believe he would be making this up after all these years. I think it's a credible piece of evidence. And,
why did Nixon have business in this offshore bank to begin with?
Well, there's a lot of stuff about Richard Nixon's access to dirty money and to his relationship with criminal elements. And, there's a whole literature on that. I won't try to replicate it, but it's been very difficult for anyone to get any proof of the dark money that he had access to. But there are all these discussions in the Watergate tapes about I have access to $1 million. I know where I can get it. If we need to bribe, when the Watergate burglars got arrested in 1973, he was trying to get them to be quiet and not implicate, his whole administration. So, there was substantial questions about where this money had come from. I think we know now it probably parked offshore in this account. So ultimately came from, and who paid them the bribes and all that kind of thing was, Nixon was never really impeached. He resigned from office. There was never a thorough investigation of all his chicanery, and sort of like Trump, we haven't gotten to the bottom of his financial chicanery either. But this was an early investigation that I did that actually showed the value of getting out in the field, finding the people on the ground, talking to them about the puzzles and the mysteries that you're seeing.
A lot of things came up while you were speaking there, but I think it's best to stick to the timeline. So,
yeah,
you said you went down there in 68, or was it 60?
No, the Castle Bank and Trust case I investigated by going to Miami in 1980-81.
81.
And
so you're 30 years old.
The bank had already been closed by, law enforcement. The principals involved in the bank, all of the 200 wealthy trust owners, were basically got off scot-free. They were never prosecuted for tax evasion, either by the Nixon administration or by the successors, even though it was a pretty clear-cut case that they'd been involved in this. And I think that was another eye-opener, sort of people of influence, kind of this transnational class of people who are making use of havens to this day, are basically also have enormous political clout, political influence, and can influence law enforcement and the prosecution of cases. So it's just very hard to bring these folks to justice. But anyway, the next phase, that kind of was my first real introduction to offshore havens and offshore banking. I mean, basically Nassau at that time, the Bahamas, was one of maybe 15 offshore havens of any size or significance at that time. There were places like Panama, the Cayman Islands was just getting going. You had the Channel Islands, and then you had traditional havens like Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, Monaco. But by and large, this was a relatively small industry back then. So we talk about the growth of treasure islands over time, and you can find all of these players going back to well, in the case of Switzerland, back to the 18th century, doing private banking for the wealthy classes in Europe, especially the French. But the kind of private banking that was going on back then was relatively small activity based on, sort of people who were serving the interests of elites that were worried about political turmoil, not so much taxation. As the tax system became more active and aggressive, and there came to be income taxes in the 20th century, the United States income tax dates back to 1913. But over time, gradually, you got tax rates that started to rise, and especially in the 1930s during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, you saw the first significant increases in progressive income tax rates during that period. That was the period when you first saw havens really begin to explode. So I have this letter from 1936 from the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, to FDR, and he's complaining about the fact that the rich in the United States, in some cases, are beginning to take their money outside the United States, putting in a number of these so-called havens, and that's the first time we see this phrase being used, sort of by a U.S. Treasury Secretary, and he's complaining about the havens. He's complaining about then are places like Newfoundland. It turns out that the Canadians had actually started to offer services to the wealth. The idea of people parking money in Newfoundland is really pretty strange. But Panama was also on his list. So that's from the mid-30s. As time goes by, especially during World War II, when you see income tax rates going above 50 to 80% or more, that's when people begin to have serious incentives. And so after the war, in late 40s, early 50s, you begin to see the growth of the sort of offshoring of private wealth to a much more dramatic degree. But what really gets it going, and this is the next phase of my research, is between roughly 1973 and 1993, you had an enormous explosion in the volume of finance that was being provided by first world banks to developing countries. And this was because we had this oil crisis in 1973. Oil prices peaked. A lot of the petrodollars that were generated by OPEC ended up not being invested in the Middle East, but they're being sent to Western banks as deposits. Well, what were the banks going to do with this money? They decided, let's pick on the third world because they don't really have regulation. They don't have taxation. They don't have any restrictions on capital flight. And so a lot of this money will just end up being recycled to us. And so they ended up doing an enormous amount of lending to countries like Mexico and Brazil and Venezuela and Argentina and the Philippines. And they all went deep into the trough in terms of external debt. This is the genesis of the so-called third world debt crisis, the first one in 1984. So that period is the period that I began to study here, because the question is, for me, the puzzle in that period was, what happened to the money? This was a period in which more than $3 trillion, it was a record number, of offshore loans and finance and investments were channeled to developing countries. And yet, almost uniformly, it didn't produce any growth. You can see the growth rate in the Philippines actually declining as the debt increased. You see similar economic crises throughout Latin America, country after country after country. So that was my next sort of big puzzle that I wanted to go after. What happened to the money? And that's the kind of the genesis of this book, Blood Bankers. The first first round of it was when I was at actually at at McKinsey and Company, where McKinsey had a very strong global presence back then, but their headquarters was in New York. So I was chief economist running this little group of people who were taking a look at some issues in the area of monetary policy and banking,
Mm-hmm.
because we had a huge banking clientele. All the major New York City banks, Citibank, J.P. Morgan, Bank America, they were all clients of McKinsey.
Can you emphasize for the audience just how significant of a firm McKinsey Co is, and also what type of access and even, I dare say, power you might have had as the chief economist of this firm?
Well, I would say, McKinsey is a very successful worker cooperative in the sense that they're run by a partnership group. They have 3 or 4 tiers, I think, now of partners, and they're very global. Even back then, they had offices not only in New York and San Francisco and Chicago, Atlanta, but also in Houston, which is the oil patch of growing. But we also had offices in London and Frankfurt and Italy, and we're beginning to expand into Asia. And today the firm is everywhere. Significant.
They'd be in almost every
basically a premier
city of note in the world, right?
Well, they have I think they're still regarded as the most influential private consulting firm. They work mostly for people in the private sector. They work mostly at top management level, working for CEOs and for people who are actually making strategic decisions. Other players in this industry, like the accounting firms, all have their consultants now, and there are other strategy firms that are just focused on strategy. But McKinsey has always established, I think, kind of the premier firm for its kind of reputation for professional integrity. They're not going to tell you what you want to hear necessarily. They pride themselves on independence of their clients. They've gotten involved lately in some horrible scandals, and I just find the place, it's a completely different institution from the one I knew in the 1980s. I think it's partly just due to the fact that they became so successful, and they also were looking over their shoulders.
Clients who are governments, right, as well as
clients who are governments. Well, some of the worst examples are, in South Africa, they were involved in basically helping the Guptas, fleece the Zuma regime. Jacob Zuma has just been let out of the hospital. He was in prison, but he had a medical parole. But he was basically a very corrupt president of South Africa from 2008 until 2016. McKinsey was involved in getting into South Africa by way of a family called the Guptas, who were very involved with Zuma's whole story. They've been involved in consulting to the Saudis. So no worse regime on the face of the earth in terms of human rights than the Saudis. But the Crown Prince MBS has trying to reform the economy there and actually have Saudis produce something more than oil. So he hired McKinsey to give him a strategy study. They've been involved in China and working there as well. So, and they were consulting to the Sackler family, which is, no one more involved in the opiate crisis in the United States than the Sacklers and Purdue, sort of pharmaceutical, with the OxyContin was their main product. I mean, tens of thousands of Americans have died as a result of that crisis, and McKinsey was right in there telling them how to push it more aggressively. So
yeah.
I've been discouraged by the evolution of the firm, but I think back in the 80s, as at that point when I was there, I was impressed with how professional they were and how they had very strong values of respecting independence and also being independent research and also doing work for the public sector. That was another thing. Volunteer to do studies for, like the city of New York. And anyway, so while I was there, I got involved in some studies of banking, and I noticed and came to see evidence that some of these big banks, at the same time that they had been lending, supposedly lending to Latin America, uh, and were the largest lenders to Latin America, were actually taking more money out in the form of capital flight than they had loaned. So Citibank was the prime example about that. Of that, and in April of 1986, I wrote a cover story for the New Republic called "The Debt Hoax," and that was explosive. The, all of, I got called in by the senior partner at McKinsey, and they said, "Did you get this data from us?" And I said, "Absolutely not." But I was able to identify exactly how much Citibank had taken out of Mexico, and compared that with how much they had done in the way of syndicated lending, and there was just no comparison.
And so
profiting
explain
from,
that significance to the viewer. Like, what does that mean?
yeah.
That
Well,
they
this is
are
connected to the Haven story, but it's not exactly the same thing. So let's step back for a second. Tax havens are places around the planet that are, first of all, they're not just tax havens. They're havens for, there's basically financial secrecy
secrecy
jurisdictions where people, that are underregulated. There's low taxation on foreigners who operate individual or business or have businesses located there. Very little regulation of their corporate activities, and it's sort of an opportunity for you to go to a place with no regulation, kind of the Ayn Rand dream. And the Haven is interested in supporting the local lawyers and the bankers and the accountants who work for these investors who come to the Haven in exchange for this permissive environment. So that's what we're talking about. I mentioned already the Bahamas and Cayman Islands, Panama,
Channel Islands, Switzerland.
Channel Islands. All these places were basically selling the same kind of bundle of underregulated activity. But what's missing from that story that emphasizes the jurisdictions and the archipelago of Treasure Islands, so-called Treasure Islands, are the institutions that are behind it. Because this is like, like the defense industry or the global airlines industry. There's a powerful private banking industry that's basically built up these havens over time. And from the standpoint of this industry, they don't care whether, there's a Nassau goes up or down. They'll just quickly replace one haven with another.
Yeah.
But the key players in this industry are the largest banks in the world. Players like Union Bank, UBS,
Deutsche,
Citibank,
HSBC.
Deutsche,
They're all involved, right?
JP Morgan. They're all the most prominent firms. And this is surprising to me. I thought that, these are fly-by-night operators in third world, shady, sultry places. No, these are the largest institutions, and they're all basically back in the first world. Their headquarters are in places like London and New York and Frankfurt, and they're operating this huge global network of havens, to serve their private banking clients and their corporate clients in terms of providing these haven services. So that's a focus that I think the Tax Justice Network years later kind of lost. They stopped talking about corporations or banks or the kind of the institutional responsibility. The McKinseys of the world. They stopped talking about the accounting firms as such. Part of that is because some of the NGOs are located in places that have tough libel laws, like the UK. And for years, it was kind of taboo to talk about. It was easier to talk about government misbehavior than it was corporate misbehavior. But for whatever reason, we kind of lost this perspective that I started with, which was focusing on what a leading Western bank was doing to developing countries. And, you could argue, as Citibank did, that this is just capital flight from Mexico was just something that they received passively. And, they were just standing there with their hats and the money came across the borders. Well, yeah, except that the guy that you made the loans to at the finance ministry is the same guy setting up private accounts with you.
Yeah.
And some of the money that he's raking off and sharing with his family and the accounts he set up offshore came from the very loans that you made. So, there was much more of this round tripping than I had ever expected. This is a real shock to me to see the degree to which they had made a business out of this cynical enterprise of lending to the very same people that they were taking money from.
Yeah. So
down the street.
It's identifying a local stakeholder, in this example, Mexico, politician, or perhaps the leader of a large construction engineering firm, and saying to him, we'll finance this project. And we've also sent down special McKinsey engineers and strategists, and look at this amazing project we can build for you. It's only going to cost this amount. And we also have access to the financing, and it's going to give you this type of rate of return and this type of growth. And look, you're also going to get a great piece of the pie here, some political clout as well. And then they start building the project and they realize that perhaps all of these projections were overinflated and overstated, and they have to eventually pay back the debt because that money is borrowed. It's not given to them. And is this too much of a straw man explanation of what's going on here?
No, I think that comes close. But what's interesting is how many variations on this basic sort of I guess you could call it kind of neo-imperialism, but it's not like there's some grand plot. It's sort of like the private sector institutions.
Yeah, it's not at the state level.
It's quite clear that the U.S. government was pretty much aware of a lot of this, but I don't think, and I don't claim that it was any kind of grand plot. There's a well-known book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which came out after Blood Bankers was published, and it touted this theory, but the guy claimed to be, John Perkins claimed to be, this operative who had been hired by the CIA to run around indebting these countries and making them dependent. I think that's all nonsense.
All nonsense? So that's very interesting. I did want to ask you about John Perkins and Confessions of Economic Hitman specifically, because it does almost give the other side of the story that you tell. It's like, and I understand that you have to take it with a grain of salt, that it is sort of embellished to over-romanticize it. But there are, your take is that it's totally BS. There isn't elements of truth to it at all.
I'm prepared to sit down with him and see his evidence. I've never found any for the theory that this was a government plot in any sense by Western intelligence agencies to indebt conscious success at that. I just don't find any evidence. And in all my, I've been to 50 developing countries. I've never seen any of these operatives that he's talking about.
But to be fair, he doesn't claim to be doing it on behalf of the CIA. He claims to be doing it on behalf of a construction firm called Maine, which is now out of business.
Charles T. Maine. I knew people who worked at Charles T. Maine when I was in Cambridge. I knew a couple. This is a good old architectural engineering firm. The idea that Charles T. Maine, this tiny, Boston consulting firm, architectural engineering is a very specific specialty. The idea that they were running around creating all these, all this chicanery is just, But again,
and it's amazing to hear you say that as well, as someone who was the chief economist at McKinsey, essentially doing the exact same thing as he's proposed to be doing, because he was also the chief economist at Maine.
Well, McKinsey was on a different scale, and they were not involved in designing these projects, and the projects that we were doing, were not involved in capital flight. We were working for the banks that were, pursuing this private banking business. and helping them to strategize about how to do that. But we weren't helping to take money out of Mexico or arranging bogus loans or projects. That wasn't what McKinsey was doing. Charles D. Main, well, maybe they did facilitate that. I just don't see it. I mean, I certainly don't see any substantial government role in this. Tolerance is another thing, though. That's a different question. Did the U.S. government actually know about these kinds of lousy loans? Did they do anything to stop this kind of egregious behavior, that was helping to bankrupt these developing countries? Absolutely not. They turned a blind eye to it, and that from that standpoint, you could fault them for it. Do they have friendly relationships with the banks, and do they have lots of people working with the financial institutions? In 50 years, I have never had much success at getting the so-called U.S. intelligence agencies to collaborate with me on anything in terms of delivering data. If they know all this stuff about financial transactions internationally, if the NSA is able to monitor this stuff, let's put it out there. Let's at least the historical stuff. Let's go back to the 1970s and 80s and look at the transactions that they're supposed to have seen. Because in theory, they should be able to tell you all about this stuff. But what I was able to do was to come up with some alternative methods for estimating capital flight from developing countries, and I did a lot of work on that, especially for TJN in terms of estimating the actual illicit flows and the illicit stocks that are sitting offshore earning money tax-free.
Yeah.
So we can talk about that a little bit later. But just to complete this thought about that McKinsey article, that led me to basically, go out and get a book contract and to begin to do the research that led to the Blood Bankers book, because the first installment was that chapter was the piece about Mexico. And that I then found that every single developing country had a slightly different story about what was going on. So I went to the Philippines. In 1986, Marcos was overthrown. Ferdinand Marcos had been dictator since 1973. And he had discovered that he could get the New York banks to basically lend profusely to the central bank of the Philippines. And so the Philippine government was on the hook for all the loans that were made by players like Manufacturers Hanover was the lead bank, syndicating bank for the central bank of the Philippines. So he, basically from 1973 to 1984, after Marcos fell in February of 1986, I went to Manila, and I think I ended up there in 1987, and I was able to go get access to the central bank records, computer printouts, and I found all of these loans that had come from Manufacturer Hanover, and I paired them up with the transactions about what was done with them.
What was actually built?
They were actually sent off. They were wired to bank accounts of Marcos in Swiss banks. Especially Swiss Bank Corp at that point was a big Marcos crony bank. So, I think we were never able to get complete data, but I estimated that about a third of the Philippine foreign debt had simply been stolen by Ferdinand Marcos and wired directly to Swiss banks.
For their personal wealth.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't even round tripped in the conventional sense of capital flight. They didn't, this guy had it all wired. It went to the central bank. It became a loan to the government of the Philippines, which was then on the hook for the debt. The New York banks got to collect that debt later on. And then Swiss banks ended up with the actual funding, which was never recovered by the Philippine government.
Yeah, to this day, right? There is rumored billions and billions of dollars of value that Imelda Marcos has access to and, won't relinquish.
Well, we think so. Yeah. I mean, part of this was creamed off by the successors, because one of the mysteries here was another puzzle. Okay, Imelda,
who is the
stole
wife?
the money. But anyway, so the Marcos story, this was pretty outrageous. And so I went to the minister, Corazon Aquino was the successor.
What a name as well.
She was supposedly a Democrat and a reformer. Yeah. And her minister of the economy basically said, well, we were going to go after the Marcos offshore accounts, but we got threatened by John Reed, who was chairman of Citibank. And he said, if you go after the Marcos story, and disrupt the New York City banks, the banks kind of stick together on this stuff. It's amazing. We will make your lives miserable. That was what he said, quote unquote. And, they have a lot of leverage with trade finance and with, transfers, just all kinds of risk assessments banks do with respect to developing countries. There's a lot of leverage that they could bring to bear. And so, and I think there was also the unofficial reasons, which you get into, which is that, some of the people who came after Marcos participated in recovering money, and putting it in their own pockets.
Yeah.
So that could also be a case. I had found that in the case of Paraguay. Paraguay in the late, I think it was 1989, had seen my work on private banking, and a fellow named General Stroessner had just been dictator, and he'd left power. And so they were eager to track down his foreign assets. And so my research assistant, a Colombian lady named Silvana Paternostro, who's now become a very talented writer, she and I took this on, and we went, she went down to Paraguay, and we looked at the phone records from Stroessner, and we found that he had indeed parked most of his money in Citibank in Miami. We told the Attorney General of Paraguay this story, and that was the last we ever heard from him. I don't want to accuse him of having pocketed the money, but it was never prosecuted, and so the story kind of just disappeared. But anyway, that was a chronic problem with doing this kind of research. You come up with exactly where the bodies are buried, and then the bodies disappear.
And you're digging into the financial transactions of extremely corrupt actions, right? Especially in developing parts of the world where there is a lot of death associated with these transactions as well. I mean, you spoke about in I don't remember the name of the place off the top of my head, but it was in Guatemala, and there were two old native villages that were totally displaced and in fact almost massacred just to make way for one of these development projects that was then going to take place there. But I don't want to leave the Philippines quite yet. There was an anecdote of Imelda Marcos building a theater, right? And could you please tell this anecdote and the person that ends up getting stuck in the concrete as a way to explain what the sort of insanity of the Philippines was at that moment?
Imelda was trying to make, when she was in power in the early 80s, she had a lot of designs to make the Manila kind of cultural capital. She wanted to start an international film festival. And so in 1981, she had all kinds of extravagant projects, and the cultural complex and the Heart Center, and a floating casino. But this was this particular film festival was one of her pet projects, and she hired a leading Los Angeles agent to produce the first edition. But the problem was that they with only a few days, a few months left to go, they were way behind on having this film center have a new auditorium. And she had designed like as usual, spared no expense to design a film center was based on the Parthenon, basically a full-scale replica of the Parthenon in downtown Manila on the Manila Bay.
Which is a terribly poor country at this stage.
Terribly poor country, couldn't afford any of this. But she had all these loans to spend. So, and then with 2 months to go, the project was way behind schedule. They had 8,000 workers working on this. I went to the site there. It's, still there to this day. And
unfinished?
Well, no, it's been finished, sadly enough. But at the end of this project, with 2 months to go, they were racing. They had a terrible catastrophe. They had several stories of this thing collapse, and they trapped, 25 workers under the rubble. There were a lot of pressures on the part of union leaders and church people to stop the work and to be, to respect the bodies of the dead that were there and to have commemoration. She refused, and she had them go back to work and continue on. And so on January 18th, 1982, they had the opening of the Grand Festival. And she, everybody with black ties, there were all kinds of dignitaries. Priscilla Presley was there. George Hamilton was there, or Peter Ustinov, Jeremy Irons, Adnan Khashoggi, just all kinds of prestigious people had been invited for this event. And then they finally turned to the films. And they had Body Heat and Gallipoli, some of these very first-rate films. But what was problematic for them was that it was a very hot night. And so the film festival that night was attended by an enormous swarm of flies all evening long, and hovering around this area where the workers had been interred without a decent burial several months earlier. The film festival ended up not making money, losing $100 million, and never seeing the light of day again. But they do have a plaque sort of honoring the workers who died trying to make this thing happen on time.
Yeah. No, I think you might have brushed over the horrific point there. Like, not only did they not stop construction, but Hermila just ordered them to pour concrete into where they lay, and everyone to just keep building around it, which drew the flies on that night.
That's right, because concrete is porous, and that's.
And so this is like a terrible anecdote that just highlights the unbelievable corruption of the Marcoses, right? But the question then becomes, and this is what your investigative journalist, this is what your book goes on to show, but could you explain to us, where is the money coming from? Why are people giving the Philippines money, especially when they can't see that money being turned into anything for the public? Could you just explain the infrastructure of all of this for us to help understand just the very, lay listener?
Well,
how do they even get access to the money?
There are two basic points to be made here. One is that development economists typically talk about developing countries as being basically responsible for their own fates. Development is a kind of indigenous process, and corruption is also regarded as indigenous, sort of local to the institutions and the culture. My perspective on that is that, there's some of that, but we have to also pay attention to the international relationships that have a profound impact on how developing countries turn out. And the nexus of relationships, including the banks and law firms and accounting firms that just, are indifferent to the fate of any particular country, but have an enormous impact on on money laundering, on tax evasion, and on kleptocracy. So that's point one. This point two is in the case of the Philippines, you also have the fact that, like most developing countries, governments can't go bankrupt. That's a key aspect of distinction from private companies. And they can run into financial trouble in which they won't be able to borrow, but they can never get loan forgiveness. Their debts are never completely canceled in most cases. There are a few exceptions to that, but there are, by and large, the great attraction of lending, if you're Citibank, to Mexico, is that Mexico is going to be on the hook, regardless of what they do with the money.
No matter how bad things get.
No matter how bad things, no matter who changed power and what president is in office, Mexico per se is going to have to come up with the payback. So that's true also for loans from multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and they become the senior creditors to countries like the Philippines. So some of the worst projects in the world you find being financed by these multilateral institutions that have, sort of demonstrated time and again kind of insensitivity. You mentioned the case of Guatemala, those two dams that led to basically the extinction of this Indian tribe. Those are World Bank loans. The World Bank didn't really care. They were trying to support the government of Guatemala at the time, which was a military junta. And there was a geopolitics involved, sort of supporting the right-wing rulers in Guatemala or the potential left-wing guerrillas. So at the time, prior to the fall of the wall in 1990, you have this dimension of geopolitics involved, where it was perceived that it was better to lend to a military government to support who was an ally of the United States than it was to to avoid corruption or waste. At least the money was getting to your friends in these places. So what I found in researching blood bankers was that there were several different canonical stories about where the money went. One was great big lousy projects. People just threw money at without any kind of care.
And by people, you're still referring to Citibank, World Bank, IMF?
I'm referring to all of those, but much of the lending was done with government guarantees or with World Bank lending directly. Much of the Citibank or the Ex-Im Bank, Export Import Bank from the United States, was also government guarantee. It wasn't necessarily the government guarantee that was essential, but to the outcome. But you basically have this idea that the banks themselves were somehow going to be relieved of responsibility for the lousy lending. They weren't on the hook with respect to how the projects turned out or what was done with the money. So it wasn't related to performance. If you have a private investment or private company that's going to depend for its payback on how a project turns out, that provides a little bit more incentive to be careful. But one of the reasons lending to developing countries was dominated by private loans or financial supply of finances to developing countries was dominated by these loans, was that they were basically independent of performance. And so there's a big kind of pathology in the international financial system was that we had some of the poorest countries on the planet that needed finance more than anyone else had set themselves and put themselves in a position where the lenders just could care less about how the projects turned out. That's kind of one of the patterns that we see here. So a second sort of pattern that we would see would be just capital flight. I mean, outright rip-offs like the kind we saw in the case of Marcos, where there wasn't even a project, and the money was just round tripped through various fronts.
So can you define capital flight for us?
Well, capital flight has to do with, first of all, we talk about human capital flight being, skills, labor leaving developing countries and moving abroad. Financial capital flight is the form of foreign reserves and foreign exchange that flees a country and goes elsewhere and ends up being owned perhaps by the residents of the country, still resident there, but is basically outside the jurisdiction of the country. So it's located in offshore banks or offshore investments, and there are a number of different ways of estimating that. You can, standard metrics that we get from sort of balance of payment statistics have figures for so-called offshore sources, like the foreign investment and loans, sources of foreign capital, and then the uses of foreign capital and sort of financing the balance of payments and accumulating exchange reserves. So you can have measures for all those four different variables, and then you can add them up, and you'll find out that in general, for most developing countries, there are huge discrepancies in the form of net outflows. In other words, the sources generally exceed the uses that you measure. And in the case of major debtors like Mexico and the Philippines and Brazil, you saw that this accumulation of hundreds of billions of dollars offshore during this seminal period. In the case of Russia and China, more recently, we've seen the same thing happen.
Yeah.
So you can actually get a handle on how much capital flight there is, and then you can compare that with other independent measures of what offshore assets there are, and all told, we now have at least $50 trillion offshore. About half of it is from.
Which is what percentage of the world's total economy? Nick Shaxson says that.
I would say it's about 15 to 20% of offshore of all wealth is parked offshore beyond the reach, but it's all owned by the top 1.1% of the population.
Of course.
So
it's owned by corporations more so, isn't it? It's not even individuals.
Yeah. I mean, it's owned by. Well, I'm talking here about mostly individually owned offshore wealth, but there is corporate offshore wealth. It's another problem, but most of that is ultimately traceable back to individual owners. So collectively in the world economy, it's kind of this gigantic black hole in the world economy where there has been essentially no progress in terms of cracking down on this. So we have so this is kind of jumping forward to the work I did with TJN in 2012 and
Tax Justice Network
up to this day. But we did the first offshore estimates, the first estimates of the volume of offshore wealth, published in 2012, and then have been updating those ever since. But the numbers just keep getting bigger. There's no evidence that this has gone away or declined, or we've gotten the whole angle on it.
Yeah.
But to go back to this period of the Philippines, I mean, one of the interesting things, I wrote this article about Marcos and the Marcos money and the central bank of the Philippines in Beijing in May of 1989, when Tiananmen Square was going on. So the Asian Development Bank had its annual meetings in Tiananmen Square in May of '89, just as all the students were gathering and building statues of liberty. And Gorbachev came and gave a talk and so forth. And I was sitting there in this hotel, just kind of trying to write this article about the Philippines.
Good time to be there.
Very bizarre. Well, it was a sad time to be there because it was I left before there was the violence moved in, but I got to know some of these students
Mm.
in the Peking daily. They were living in this in incredible conditions, but I have this poignant memory of their actually building the Statue of Liberty and reading the Declaration of Independence and assuming that the Americans would come to their aid, and that we would stand up to the repressors who were about to move in. Of course, that didn't happen. Bush basically, George Bush one, basically expressed some regret, but then our relationship with the Chinese dictatorship was immediately put back into first place, and that was a sad time for me because I saw our government kind of walking away from defending democracy in that place at a time when we had enormous leverage over China and could have affected the outcome, just like we had in Russia. Also failed to achieve a democratic transition there. But that's another whole aspect of
Yeah.
the discussion here. I think leading up to that period, the debt crisis and blood bankers is really focusing on what happened to the money and setting up the next chapter, which was what happened in Russia and China.
Yeah.
Why do we end up with Russia and China having become plutocracies?
Jim, just to take me back to the nuts and bolts of the Philippines. So you explained that the difference between, say, a corporation can go bankrupt, but a country can't. They're always on the hook for the money. It explains the incentive why you might want to lend to that nation, but you still want a return, right? So could you explain to us why, even though billions and billions of dollars and euros and francs and all the rest are going into the Philippines, they're not actually being turned into any sort of productive asset that can then repay that loan. Instead, the money is being wired into someone's personal account. So the economics of that doesn't make sense. Could you explain still why people are and did going to lend to these developing nations, even though they're not turning out something on the other side that's repaying the loan itself? It seems like a
well, I think
dynamic.
this is a little bit of a complicated story about the way banks work, and it's not as if no banks lost money by lending to developing countries. They did, in some cases, like Citibank, they had close calls, and J.P. Morgan at the end of the 80s, they were in trouble, but they had friends in Washington to bail them out. That was part of the story. So part of the story here is that, the lending manager who's at Citibank for Mexico is never going to have history catch up with him if he makes some bad loan and then he moves on to, the next job because he's gotten, his metrics are attractive. He has a huge lending portfolio. And by the way, he's producing an awful lot of income for the private bank, who have the finance minister as a client, and that's just an absolute reality. There's all kinds of people within the banking institutions that profited from lousy loans and private banking, who history never caught up with them and said, well, by the way, those loans never were productive. Those funds
Complete
were
lack
stolen.
of skin in the game.
Yeah. So there was there was kind of impunity, institutional impunity at the kind of the level of individuals within these institutions. I think the other thing is that this chronic problem of government guarantees and of bailouts has been a kind of a moral hazard that we've never solved. And we saw that in the 2008 financial crisis, where there were huge bailouts to U.S. financial institutions, and most of the people who were involved in those in the chicanery that led to the mortgage crisis. I mean, what happened in 2008 was kind of this third world lending behavior of institutional irresponsibility, irresponsible corporate lending, came back to haunt us in importing this very same kind of lending practices to the United States with the mortgage crisis. I mean, there are all kinds of variations on the details, and they were lending to housing projects and real estate projects that were, you know, poorly conceived, and on a much larger scale than the developing world crisis. But that was the precedent for it. And basically the same kind of institutional responsibility. Banking is a problem for capitalism. There's a central issue with banks. Banks have enormous political influence. They're very hard to regulate, and they keep on making mistakes on a massive level, sort of en masse at once. So every 10 years or so, you have these whopping crises, either in developing countries or the first world. You know, part of the deal with the late 90s in the United States, we became deregulators, and we allowed the banks to come home and to do many of the same things they were doing in the third world countries in the United States, and getting away with it. So, you know, there is this problem with bank regulation. There's this kind of systemic problem for capitalism. It's nothing new. It goes back to at least the 18th century, and you know, it's still with us now. I was struck by the fact in the case of the Philippines that, you know, another big player in the late 90s was Timothy Geithner, who ended up as Treasury Secretary. He was in charge of the, you know, sort of at that point in the IMF. He was working in Asia when they had the 1998 crisis in Indonesia, which affected all Southeast Asian countries. So you had another debt crisis, again due, in the case of Indonesia, to a dictatorship, Suharto, who you know, just got away with all kinds of lousy lending to himself. The World Bank, you know, to this day has not accounted for the bad lending that they made in that situation. I interviewed. It's another case that I was never able to, you know, to write about. You know, there's just so many hours in the day. But Indonesia is yet another case, a similar thing, where, you know, the World Bank lending officers knew that at least half of the loans that they were making especially to the banking sector, were going into the general's family's friendly banks, and they were making loans to themselves. You know, well, we know where that ends. And that was a major sort of theme of the Indonesian
and that's
crisis in 1998. A recurrent theme here is this sort of insider trading, if you will, that goes on
corruption
within the banking corruption. And it's not just it's not just the indigenous, you know, kind of corrupt Filipinos or the corrupt Indonesians. It's these Western institutions that we are, you know, sort of that are depending on us to have laws that work, and an independent courts, and all of their, you know, the institutions they take for granted here. Basically abusing the privilege by going off to strange places and making lousy loans. And that's, you know, sort of the kind of the generic responsibility the world system has for the fate of some of these developing countries that are still struggling with the consequences to this day.
Yeah. So the corruption from the private banking side of things, the sort of amoral approach to where your money is going, is understandable just from the incentives level. I'm making more money for my institution, I get promoted myself, whatever. But the same sort of incentives don't make sense from the IMF and the World Bank perspective, unless you assume a similar amorality in the incentives. Could you explain, is it just explicable that easily that the same incentives exist for the private banks as they do the IMF and the World Bank, or is there more to it?
Well, the World Bank, you know, let's distinguish the World Bank from the IMF a little bit here. The IMF's charter is to kind of deal with short-term financial crises. Now, they have, in the case of countries like Argentina, they have a pattern of sort of going in heavy and bailing out generally the conservative regimes, and then getting stuck with a whole lot of debt. But, you know, in general, they're dealing with more short-term, you know, sort of balance of payments crises. They are, however, present at the table in many of these situations where they're seeing the problems gather. And so in the Philippines, there's I was told about this instance where, the IMF representative in Manila had known all about the chicanery that was going on with Marcos. And at a certain point, there was a meeting in which there was a blackboard was busted, and he was fired summarily. But in general, the World Bank has a different charter in these countries. It's to finance longer term projects and to provide longer term lending at basically subsidized rates to stimulate development. It really got going if you look at the history of the bank during the Cold War. And so, people like Robert McNamara led the bank for a long time after he was Secretary of Defense in the United States. And his sort of explicit mission was to provide developing countries with the kind of future that didn't involve communism. So it was kind of an almost explicit charter on his on our part to help shore up regimes that were non-communist around the planet. So some of the biggest lenders or sort of borrowers in that period were countries that were on that path of non-communist development, whether it was dictatorship or not. So Brazil, for example, was a major borrower from the World Bank for a long period of time. The Philippines was one of the largest borrowers from the World Bank. They were viewed as, basically an American kind of colony in Southeast Asia. I think the question of whether World Bank executives would have different incentives than private bankers, a lot of them are the same people. I mean, there's a lot of revolving doors in these institutions. People come and go from the same, so if you want to become chief lending officer of the World Bank for a period of time, or the IFC is another major player here, you have a certain amount of influence just from that phenomenon.
Yeah.
But I think there are private, ultimately the World Bank has to sell its bonds, and so it has incentives to to sort of maximize profits just in the way that private institutions do. But it also gets basically a pass on how many of these projects turn out. Yeah. I think if we actually did a thorough audit of all the projects the World Bank has been involved in, I think the results would be pretty mixed. So I guess that brings us kind of to the end of the 80s. We have, the cases of Argentina is an interesting one.
I mean, there are so many. If you wouldn't mind, I just want to ask one before we leave the Philippines. Yeah. Just one last one from the Philippines.
Yeah.
I was in correspondence with Nicholas Shaxson, a comrade and colleague of yours at the Tax Justice Network, and author of Treasure Islands.
Yes.
Another very prominent voice on tax havens and tax avoidance. And I said, terrific. What should I ask Jim? And he said, there's a lot of interesting things. But he said specifically, ask him about the poisoned scrambled eggs. He thinks it was in the Philippines. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Well, this brings back the memory of how I actually got the story. I mean, I had gotten all this data from the Central Bank of the Philippines. It had been lying around as far as I could tell, on the warehouse floor, and nobody had analyzed it. But it was uncorroborated, and I needed someone to say, yeah, this is what happened. And so I went back to Manny Hanny, where manufacturers Hanover had been this large syndicating bank to the Philippines. And they ultimately got, I think, acquired by Chemical Bank, and then Chemical Bank got acquired by JP Morgan and so forth. So they're no longer around. But at that point, they still had economists who had worked in the Philippines on the financial crises. And I located the guy who, when the Philippines basically went belly up in 1984, had gone to Manila. And he told me that for 1 week during that period, he had access to 2 sets of books. He had access to the loans that had come in from the New York banks to the central bank. And he had the central bank's books showing what they had done with the money. And he said he added up the 2 sets of numbers, and there was a discrepancy of $7 billion. And the discrepancy was accounted for by the fact that they had transferred a lot of money offshore to Switzerland. Yep. And so at the end of this period, he said, suddenly someone from the central bank realized that he, as the outside auditor, had seen this and came into the room and shut down the operation. The next morning, he was sent home, and he got on a flight from the Philippines and ended up in an emergency ward in Seattle, having been poisoned on the plane. And so I have that story on tape somewhere. But yeah, this young economist had nearly lost his life. I believed him. I never, did I go try to confirm all this? No. I mean,
yeah,
it's almost too incredible to story, but it's certainly consistent with what I found, which was this huge discrepancy in the loans that the Philippines had booked. And
did people go after you as well, because trying to turn over leaves that expose a lot of people's crimes, right? How often did you feel physically threatened throughout the research for this book?
I've been threatened over the phone. Senior vice president for J.P. Morgan that I write about in the chapter on Brazil, basically threatened to kill me. He's no longer with us, but that's nothing to do with me. He that was an example. I didn't take that too seriously, although he was a hot-headed kind of guy.
Right.
He had been involved in all kinds of, we could talk about, that's a great story, actually. But in the case of Panama, we haven't talked about that episode. I was in Panama in 1987 during a period in which General Noriega was still in power. And he, of course, we know now that he was deeply involved in drug trafficking with the Colombian cartel, some parts of it. And he had an airline called Inair, INAIR. And his partner in the airline was a guy named Ricardo Bolanek, who was a Colombian and lived in Panama City. And so, this is a period of growing opposition to the Panamanian, to the dictatorship. So someone came forward who was a lawyer with the opposition, I thought, and offered me, he said he has his brother-in-law was a cargo manager at Inair. And he offered me Noriega's phone records for 3 years. And so I got those phone records, and they showed all of these calls to, Colombians, also quite a few interesting calls to Washington, D.C. So that raised a lot of questions, and I was very sensitive about having these phone records in my possession. They ended up being used in the trial of General Noriega. About 3 years later, I was working at a corporate job up at Lotus, and these 2 DEA agents came to my office and had me validate the trail of evidence for use in this trial. It was one of the key pieces of evidence in his trial and conviction. But anyway, to finish the story in Panama, during that period, I got it into my head to investigate this murder that had gone on in Panama of a health minister named Hugo Spadafora. Spadafora was a young guy who had been, first of all, under Torrijos and then under Noriega, had been a very progressive kind of health minister and had, you know, done things like fought in Africa with Che Guevara and stuff like that. Very progressive. And he thought,
A revolutionary.
Revolutionary kind of hero. And he found out first, more than before anybody did, that Noriega was involved in all this drug trafficking. I mean, basically, INAIR was sending, between 1984 and 87, they were sending a ton of cocaine every month on Sanyo refrigerators.
Wow.
Packed into
commercial
their
flights.
airline to Miami, sending it right up the middle.
Yep.
They weren't, and they would get to the airport, they would offload it on the side of the airstrip, and then they would fly on. Now, this could not have happened without complicity from U.S. authorities. It just simply could not have happened without that. And Spadafora thought,
couldn't, I mean, does it have to be national authorities? Couldn't it just be airport authorities?
I doubt it. I really don't think that they could have, over this long-term period, a ton of cocaine every month. I think what we, and I didn't ever track that aspect of it down. But I mean, there's plenty of stuff to look at here if we can go back and check the historical records. But basically, Bolanek was later tried and convicted. The point about Spadafora was that he thought, reasonable enough, that surely the U.S. government would love to hear about this.
Mm-hmm.
And the DEA, I should go to San Jose. So he decided he would have a meeting with the DEA in San Jose. Unfortunately, there was a CIA agent in the room. And what you learn about the U.S. government, it's not a monolith. The CIA was backing Noriega. The DEA was basically in a big conflict with the CIA throughout that period. And so somebody in that room picked up the phone and called Noriega. And when Spadafora came back to the border in Cherokee, he was picked up and killed. Not just killed, he was butchered, left in a body bag. So I decided when I was there in 87 that I would investigate this murder. This is while Noriega was still in power, because I was, pretty upset about having discovered all this. And so the attorney for the family, Spadafora family, and I flew out to Cherokee and spent some, tense nights I'll never forget the rainstorms out there.
Where's Cherokee?
Hotel.
This is in Panama as well?
Cherokee is this Cherokee province where the murder occurred. It's there's a road from San Jose to Panama that goes through that area. And we actually succeeded in finding some of the military people who were involved in, sort of cleaning up after the murder. They gave us some interesting information. I get on the plane back to Panama City, and I'm getting off the plane, and there's three plainclothes policemen asking, "Are you Jim Henry?" And I said, "Yep." And I guess at that age I was pretty much more nimble than I am now. I kind of OJ'd around them and
Really?
out of the airport into the streets of Panama City, got back to my hotel, grabbed everything as fast as I could, and I showed up at Silvana Paternoster, who I mentioned earlier. Her father had been a Colombian diplomat in Panama City, and she had a lot of friends there. So I showed up at the uninvited at the apartment of one of them and said, you gotta hide me out. Here's the situation. They were not pleased to see me, but anyway, for a couple days there was touch and go, and then finally I got escorted to the airport by a guy who was a legislator. He got me through customs and got on a plane, got out of there. But
I mean, Jim, that's
you know,
wild. I
well,
mean, you outrun
it
them.
was at the
That's
time,
good.
you know, it was sort of like one step after another. You know, what do we do next?
Hmm.
It wasn't very well thought out. It certainly wasn't very rational. But I think sometimes you get taken with the story, and you just want to see it done. And
Do you
realize
think those three plainclothes police officers posed a lethal threat to you, or it was just to
well,
intimidate
if I'd been jailed in Panama and they put you in a cell with you know, an AIDS victim, I mean,
you? Right.
there's a lot of nasty ways to go.
That's a
And
nasty way
so
to go.
that's you know, it's not. But I wouldn't have trusted Noriega's jails to be very hospitable, even to
Yeah.
an American at that point. But you know, I may be exaggerating. I'm not trying to. You know, this story has never been about me, and that's why I've really never talked about all this stuff, because you know it's really a focus on the story as
Mm.
opposed to, you know, the journalist. And you know, kind of. I mean, but I've had some interesting encounters that I think may be of value to younger journalists who want to, you know, sort of follow this path and say, you know, what are the things that work? What are the things that are, you know, worth looking at? And what's the importance of getting out
Mm.
of the office?
Something that fascinates me about your story is that you're an exceptional student. You've gotten scholarships all the way through Harvard, law degree, economics degree, postgraduate, chief economist at McKinsey. I mean, and this is, I think, before you're 30 or just as you're 30. I mean, you have the golden resume to go and take whatever job you like. Yet you know, you go off and say no to loads of money and power and influence and all of that, and you know, go into Latin America and investigate capital flight. So, like, that's so fascinating. Can you explain how you reflect on that, and at the time, what drove you to make that sort of decision?
Well, I'd say it's a little more complicated than that. You know, I kept bouncing back and forth between corporate and business activities and this investigative stuff. So uh, the sequence was, you know, McKinsey, and then I went worked at Lotus development with in the software industry, and then I in the mid 90s just to survive. You know, you can't investigative journalism of this kind. You know, I mean, Samuel Johnson once said, "No one but a fool writes but for money." Well, this was everything but lucrative. You know, it was fascinating. It was, you know, captivating, but it, you know, you can't survive and have a family based on, you know, writing $3,000 or $4,000 of articles a month for, you know, the New Republic. So um, I kept bouncing back and forth, and I had my own consulting firm in the 90s, and that did very well because I was just focusing on technology, and I worked for AT&T Bell Labs, and so I was fortunate enough to have this life preserver that could keep,
Right.
you know,
I mean, you have the
keep
golden
me
resume.
afloat,
Like, you can always
keep
step
me
back into
afloat,
it.
and I could keep doing that stuff forever on technology and strategy, and lately, you know, consulting to uh, companies building smart grids. So yeah, there's a definitely, I mean, one of the themes is here that, you know, if you're just an investigative journalist all your life, you end up being hostage to uh, publishing firms or newspapers that may have themselves a kind of a lot of trouble and a hard time supporting you, and you may have all kinds of limitations on the kind of work you can do then. So there's something great about being independent and a kind of a freelance journalist and writing for lots of places creatively. You know, so if you can afford to do kind of a dual career thing, that's what I found in my case. You know,
Hmm.
was successful. But the idea about values is an interesting one. I'm not sure I fully understand this thing. I think, you know, the psychologist Carl Jung has a interesting discussion of how when he became 30, 35, 35, I think was the age he pointed to, there was something called metatonia, in which you basically say, okay, I've done, a successful family, I've got a career, I've done, and I've succeeded to that extent, and that's sort of under my belt. But now I have to find my soul, and now it's up to me to discover what I'm really
to get into the path of
here
individuation.
to do. And you find that at that point, the individuation, that you are looking for meaning, and in a way that you weren't before. Now, a lot of people don't get there, and they have all kinds of trouble on that way. But if you're fortunate enough to get into a situation where you have some choice, then this sense of responsibility, I think, sometimes takes over, and you look for callings. You find things, and maybe in medicine, and maybe in many other fields, but in my case, it was journalism.
And specifically uncovering a bunch of corrupt money. You saw a higher calling in that because you had such a specific set of skills that would be able to actually make that possible.
Well, I think that's part of it. The economics, the law, these are useful skills,
McKinsey,
the background, and all that kind of stuff. But it was also, there's not, it's an unusual intersection of know-how. But I think at the end of the day, it's also just, the stories just kept on coming. So once you open this valve, it was like the floodgates. It was hard to say no. Each one was different, so every story turned out to be fascinating. Brazil is a great example. I must have been to Brazil about 15 times, and had some incredible luck just meeting a private banker for a big drug dealer in Brazil on the plane going down, getting introduced to that whole network of people.
Yeah,
and
your chapter on Brazil is my favorite from the book.
Well, thank you. We ended up going to a place in Bahia, which is on the northeast coast of Bahia, and there was a hotel called the Hotel Ensenada, and I, talking to the hotel manager there, we were able to get again phone records. I love phone records. The problem with the cell phone is they're harder to get. But this hotel had been the kind of the meeting place, the regular watering hole for this very influential J.P. Morgan banker, who'd basically run a kind of racket with leading Brazilian officials for a decade, in which they were making loans to finance the imports of Libyan tanks from the Gaddafi, or to selling tanks to Gaddafi. Illegal
Brazilian
loans.
tanks?
They're Brazilian tanks. They're sold by the big Brazilian arms company at a time when that was verboten. And they were splitting commissions, and the commissions were ending up. And this is another story where I didn't actually get to the end of this story until 2003, when I found out indirectly that all the money had been stashed in this Hamburg bank by Gebauer and these Brazilian officials. So you can imagine these officials coming together every month or two in this obscure hotel in Ensenada, and they thought they were safe. Well, not for me, because I actually traveled to Bahia, got the phone records, and there they were.
Brazil seems to be, of all the developing nations in the 80s and 90s, the most egregiously abused. This is just going off what you've written in that book. I don't have I don't have a wider knowledge informing that assumption, but just from the book. And I'd like to introduce Brazil just via something you wrote in the chapter, at the beginning of the chapter. as a way for you to explain to us what a debt elephant is and hopefully further our understanding of what is actually happening in blood bankers. What are you talking about? What is this corruption and capital flight? So if you'll allow me just to read a short passage.
Right.
Almost everywhere one goes to research the history of the development crisis, one hears a similar tale. An official visits his friend, an official of another country, who has an impressive estate, fancy cars, and a collection of polo ponies. How did you get so rich? He confidentially asks. I will show you, he says in response. He takes his friend on a drive to a dam. See that project? 50%. Later, viewing an even more impressive estate, he is asked, how did you get so rich? He says, I will show you. And then they take a drive to a river where a major dam was supposed to have been built. You see that dam, the first official says, pointing to a completely unobstructed river, so there is no dam. 100%. As Brazil's finance minister, Maria Henrique Simonsen, once remarked, there were many cases in which such 100% commissions might actually have been less wasteful than the monstrosities that were in fact constructed. The development crisis is not an abstraction. The carnage is everywhere. So take the Balbina hydro project in Brazil as an example that you write about. And can you explain it as this archetypal debt elephant?
Yeah, well, I guess let me try to find that, because I'll never do justice to the details of it. Balbina is this incredible dam. For example, Balbina, a 250 megawatt hydro dam on the river Uitami near Manaus, in the middle of the Amazon River basin, was designed for Eletronorte, the federal power company in the Amazon, by Andrade Gutierrez, another influential Brazilian construction firm. Quite coincidentally, Andrade Gutierrez also built a house in Teresópolis, it's a city in Brazil, for President General Geisel, and an equestrian center in Brasilia for his successor, President João Figueiredo. Balbina's 5 turbines were supplied by a French company, Nerpic, and financed with French export credits. Just coincidentally, former French Prime Minister Giscard d'Estaing's family owned a stake in the company Nerpic, and his cousin headed France's export credit agency. Originally priced at $383 million, Balbina's actual price tag turned out to be nearly to exceed $800 million. Even if it had worked as advertised, that would have made Balbina's electricity the most expensive in Brazil up to that point. But Balbina was so poorly designed that when its artificial lake started filling up in 1987, the water just kept on spreading. Eventually, it flooded more than 2,000 square miles, including an Indian reserve. The inhabitants, the Waimiri and Atarari tribes, had to be relocated by force. The lake was also not logged beforehand, so it became impossible to navigate because of all the submerged trees. At least a dozen exotic animal and fish species were wiped out, and the lake will not be habitable by fish or wildlife anytime soon because of all the acid gas produced by the trees. Indeed, the rotting trees produce 3 million tons of methane every year, up to 28 times the output of greenhouse gases from an equivalent coal-fired plant. In 1988, Eletronorte also discovered that Lago del Balbina's water level was so low that the lake would never reach its designed output unless another 700 million was spent to dam another river and destroy another Indian reserve. So the dam's output was now just 112 megawatts, half of the original design, and less than 1/16 power of the Tucumã hydro dam, which flooded 200 fewer square miles. So that's a monstrosity. It was pretty typical of these kinds of dams in particular.
Like scarily typical. There were so many of those examples, hundreds even.
Oh yeah, I mean, dams were just one category of these things. And I say this as, my grandfather, Frank Henry, built the first concrete dam on the Hudson River in the 1890s, and so it was a concrete dam.
Mm.
Dams can be useful, but these projects were so poorly designed and crafted that they are routinely rife with not only overpricing.
Mm-hmm.
We saw that recently, and there's another Brazilian construction company that's been implicated in corruption all over Latin America in the last decade or so. And,
Yeah, weren't they building roads literally in the middle of nowhere that weren't even connecting to towns? And the former female president was involved. It's just pure corruption. It's more of the same of what you just read.
Right, exactly. Well, the Brazilian construction industry is just a rife with this kind of corruption, and it was extremely influential politically. When I was there in 1989, I followed the leading candidate for president around. His campaign was just going. It was Lula, and it was the first time he'd run for president. He was head of the mine workers union, of the metal workers union, and had lost one of the fingers on his left hand. So he was quite a character. And I went all over the sugar plantations outside of Sao Paulo with Lula on an election march that he was going on. I was, that was an eye-opening episode, because the reason he did not win that time was because about 2 weeks before the election, the media in Brazil, which is heavily influenced by moneyed interest, especially O Globo, the big conglomerate there, put out a story about him having fathered a child by a woman out of wedlock. And in Brazil, that was, anathema. And, they sunk his election chances to zero. And the fellow they elected turned out to be an enormous crook. So that was just eye-opening. Lula came back and became president of Brazil in the 2000s, and is right now being considered again, if we can get rid of Bolsonaro, who is, threatening to stage a coup. As of today in Brazil, there's an enormous fear that they're trying to.
Not a good force on Latin American.
But if Lula comes back into power, I mean, I think he will be, he became somewhat influenced by these powers around him during his last term in office. But he was a relatively good president, as Brazilian presidents go. Certainly nothing like the fellow who beat him.
Can you describe why that Balbina example is the archetypal debt elephant?
Yeah, well, I think you end up with a project that's not only wasteful and doesn't perform, it's positively harmful, and it creates all kinds of economic externalities, negative effects, and is in that sense, it's kind of unfair to elephants, really. I mean, elephants are wonderful creatures, and if you spend any time around them, they're
you're branding elephants badly. You could have called them debt dragons.
Debt dragon, something to indicate that they're basically up to no good. And so this project had so many negative aspects to it. I mean, it enriched people who just went on to do lousy other things, other lousy projects. Politicians who didn't deserve to be in power. It enriched companies that were just thoroughly. Odebrecht was the firm that I was.
That was another interesting part of that.
That's the one. And Odebrecht was involved in this project, and they were, they've been a big player over the last 50 years in Brazil in terms of creating this kind of cartel that has a lot of influence in Congress. So, I mean, I've had so many disappointing experiences in Brazil that it's sort of heartbreaking to see what's
I can imagine
happened to the country. And I briefly got involved in an attempt to get a telecommunications company off the ground in the mid-90s, and we actually had a lot of success in getting that done and raised a bunch of money for it. And then all of a sudden, our partner in Brazil turned out to be a complete crook, which should have been no surprise to me. But hope springs eternal. So, you know,
perhaps perhaps I'll explain why I thought that particular Balbina example was so good at framing what the entire book was about, and then you please pick apart my understanding of it to say whether it's accurate or not. But in line with the narrative, without the CIA conspiracy that Confessions of an Economic Hitman tells, it's this story of European and American engineering and construction firms, American finance coming into town, promising all of the good positive externalities of building this hydro dam because you're going to create value for your local community. You as the political leader are going to get clout. You're also going to get a nice cut of money on the side. And it's going to end up creating a bunch of economic value that you'll be able to then repay our loans. So we're going to be made whole as well. And we can add you to our portfolio of successful developments in developing nations. And it all is just, that's all this nice wrapping that it's all presented as, you know, and the fancy businessman comes in, who is John Perkins in this case, and he can deliver with the professionalism. Look at these reports my engineers have put up. Look at these other projects we've done beforehand. And by the way, we're going to take you to the nicest restaurant in town. And then eventually it starts going, and then under the wrapping, there's like an understanding that you're going to take most of this money. You're okay with that. You also know that we're just here to also create a lot of value for ourselves. And you end up with this just terrible consequence where you have a hydro dam that actually produces more negative impacts than it does good impacts. It would actually have been better off to have just taken that money and sunk it down the hole instead of building something there at all. And none of the money is trickled down into the local economy or the broader economy at all. It's siphoned off to a number of people. It's just bad the whole way down. And this, from my understanding of reading project after project that you uncover throughout the book, just continually tells that story again and again. So,
well, yeah. And I think that story is, you know, what we're living today in with the Afghanistan experience. I mean, there was, you know, the numbers vary in terms of how much we actually spent in Afghanistan. But I guess a conservative estimate is that at least $140 billion went into so-called aid money that was supposed to go toward development.
Didn't they say 2 trillion over 20 years?
Well, there are numbers, you know, a lot of that goes to the military. And so a lot of it goes to military spending. And I think that was one of the problems with the structure there. We had a kind of a military approach to that. But, you know, that, I mean, there are a number of lessons to be learned here. We have had successful examples of nation building by the U.S. Government and by its NATO allies. I mean, we have, first of all, Europe, so after the end of World War II, and Japan are successful examples of nation building. I think that they would, you know, now what they seemed to have been dependent upon was the fact that we could get away with a fair amount of direct administration during this period, to the extent that we never tried to implement in places like Iraq or Afghanistan. There was this, I think, infectious kind of ideology that we had discovered between the early 50s and the late, 1990s, which was neoliberalism and the emphasis on private sector development and private companies being the engines of growth. And so, you know, I knew the guy who was in charge of the privatization program in Iraq. He had been at McKinsey and Company. He knew nothing about Iraq. But he did know a lot about making money in a developing country with venture capital. And, you know, you buy the scarce stuff and you're going to sell it back to them. So there was this, I say, ideal sort of romantic view of market market-led development that infected a lot of these efforts. It was ideology that was touted by the World Bank and the IMF. Other multilateral development banks, were in favor of creating stock markets in these places and privatizing everything in sight. It turned out in many cases just to be a failure, but it complemented this sort of emphasis on private contractors moving in, making a lot of money, no one having responsibility for the results, private banks and the World Bank sort of making a lot of loans. And, sort of all that kind of private sector oriented sort of, I think, really kind of idealized version of what capitalism is all about. Capitalism has always succeeded most, it turns out, when there's a very strong state. And that was true in the United States as well. State-led institutions that were able to be the icebreaker for development. In the cases like Brazil and Mexico and Argentina, and on, you see, and Iraq, Afghanistan, you see very weak states. The theme is that the state has to get out of the way, and
right.
And we have to decentralize, and we have to have private actors take the lead. That's not what happened in Japan. It's not what happened in the United States. Most of the successful development cases that we have for Western capitalist countries had a very strong component of state-led growth, and that certainly was the case in Japan and Germany, France, even the UK. And I think that we basically failed to learn the lessons of our own history and the history of developing country after developing country. When you look up close at what's going on, you find these failed states, really.
So I wanted to ask you about the following, Jim. You started off by saying your first bit of investigative journalism was looking at the underground economy of the United States, saying, where are these $100 bills? How many of them are in circulation? But I've never seen one before. Mexico is a country that is extremely close to my heart. Famously, and I don't know how true this is, but famously, the Mexican underground economy, which is just to say the cash economy that isn't recognized as productive output via the GDP figures, could be as big as their actual economy, which is recognized. On the surface, what are the implications of that? When you have a person whose entire life runs through the handing and giving out of cash, they never produce taxable receipts for the government to then be able to reinvest into the public utility that they're consuming in their town, the roads, the access to the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on the implications of an underground economy, and if you could make the comparison with my nation I'm in right now, Sweden, which is cashless, and Mexico, which is only cash.
Yeah. Well, Mexico is a favorite topic of mine. I mean, they say, Mexico's history with the United States has been kind of a miserable experience of being next door to a greedy superpower, expanding slave states, and the Texans, sort of remember Robert Duvall's line about Texans, the worst white people in the world. Sorry. But no, I mean, Mexico suffered from too much of its neighbor over time, and that continues to have shown up. I was, sort of very interested in the outflows of money from the Mexican government in the early 80s, when they had a fairly corrupt president. And I thought that he would have established the record for corruption. But then his successor, Salinas, came to power by virtue of a rigged election in the mid '80s, in which the
Famously
United
depicted
States,
in Narcos as well. I just want to say on the
yeah,
side.
and
For
so you
people that
know
haven't
the
seen
whole
it.
story about all that. What Narcos doesn't really tell you about was this. We mentioned the fellow I was looking at in Panama,
Mm.
but there was also this DEA agent Kiki Camarena,
Hmm.
who was tortured to death in 1985. And it's sort of a similar kind of story, because I think my hypothesis was that a lot of this drug money was ending up being used by the Contras and by the CIA to finance the drug wars, and to finance the Contras in Nicaragua. I'd first come across those in 1984 when I made a film in Honduras um, about land reform, and I flew down there not knowing anything about uh, the Iran Contra business or the Contra army that we were putting together. But it turned out that Honduras, which is a poor little country in the middle of Central America, was a staging ground for the U.S. Backed army that was invading Nicaragua. And a lot of this had been paid for by drug money. Camarena was this DEA agent who was active in Mexico and basically was involved in identifying some of the connections in the hierarchy of the Mexican government with respect to the cartels at that point. And he was tortured to death. And the reason that he was tortured was because they were very concerned to find out what exactly the DEA knew about his high-level connections with the Mexican government, about the cartel's high-level connections with the Mexican government, with the Contras, and with the CIA. And it turns out that there's a lot of evidence that one of the agents who was involved in the torture sessions, actually, was a fellow named Felix Rodriguez, who was a longtime CIA agent, is still wandering around Miami as we speak, but had a long-time career for the CIA with respect to Latin America. We don't really know everything that Rodriguez has been involved in, but he was clearly present, according to 3 different witnesses, at these torture sessions where this DEA
Another CIA conspiracy.
And this is very consistent with my experience with Spadafora in San Jose. That he was basically sacrificed by virtue of a phone call from the CIA agent, whose name I have, to Noriega. So these are disturbing patterns of events. They indicate that it's more, again, than just Mexico at stake here. It's this relationship with the world system and with the good neighbors to the north that have helped to perpetuate these inequalities. Anyway, the election in 1987, which was the first time that we had a chance to really elect a independent left-wing president in Mexico, was basically stolen by Salinas, who later ended up on the board of the Wall Street Journal. He's back in Mexico living today, has a lot of influence there. And his brother turned out to be a major drug trafficker. And as Narcos tells the story about Salinas in some detail. But to this day, we have this very, very problematic situation in Mexico, where the underground economy is kind of the least of the problems. I mean, yes, the underground economy makes it difficult to tax and to regulate, and people get used to living off the books, and the state is weak. Has a hard time acting independent of the private sector, or having any control over it. There are very successful and able companies in Mexico. I mean, I've worked for a couple of them, but companies like Cemex, where the leading cement company in Mexico,
Yeah.
very, very profitable and successful company, very well managed. Um, the One of my colleagues is a fellow named Fernando Flores, who was Salvador Allende's Minister of Finance. And he and I had a project working for Cemex. I worked with a team of people that he was working with on business design problems and the problem of managing large enterprises. After he spent 4 years in jail in Pinochet's prisons, he came to the United States, took a PhD, and Flores, is now a senator back in Chile. But we worked for these outstanding Mexican companies. When we showed up at Aero Mexico, they were late with their planes 98% of the time. So Fernando stood up in front of the entire management team and said, "The problem with you guys is you're all bullshitting each other. Nobody's telling the truth in this organization. So I'm going to give you permission to tell the truth. So stop bullshitting each other." And that was a classic example where you could make an intervention in a kind of a cultural, in a corporate culture, and have some success with it. But Mexico has these chronic problems, many of which just derive from us.
Implications of the underground economy beyond, put on your economist's hat, like rather than the larger problems of Mexico's political corruption and their the fact that they live because of the demand of their northern neighbor.
Yeah.
What are imagine a perfectly functioning government. What are the implications of underground economies and having cash economies, and that comparison with Sweden, which is cashless?
Well, you end up with a lot of people who are living off clever chicanery or the thwarting thereof, as Thorstein Veblen calls it. A sort of unproductive enterprise. And they spend a lot of time hiding the books, double books, and inventing stories about what's really going on. They're not necessarily inventing health-giving new technologies. They're kind of engaged in subterfuge. So, there's that whole distortion and sort of diversion of productive energies. I mean, I imagine the cartel's financial managers are pretty talented people. They're moving money around the planet, and they're hiding it in various forms, and they have to stay up with the latest money laundering tools and techniques. And that's, sort of, they're smart people. But what else could they be doing? I mean, many things that they prefer to be doing, probably.
Yeah.
And it can't be, as we see in Narcos, people are living on the run. Many cases there's all kinds of violence and fear and anxiety. And I think the major problem is metaphysical. It's sort of a question of what the hell are you doing with your life? Why this? I mean, that was the thing. I could not finish watching Narcos, because after a certain point, it got to be, okay, sort of one more episode about, people wasting their lives on this, sort of pseudo wealth. But I think the other thing about Mexico is that it has, by virtue of having everything, a large chunk of the economy off the books and not measured, it has a hard time really understanding where it stands in terms of investments, in terms of the overall incomes that people are making. I mean, how well are they doing?
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to to know kind of
how the existing funds should be distributed.
What's going on?
All the data is skewed.
It's a mystery. You can't measure anything. So I think that there's the good news is that they have enormous potential and very talented people, and many of their people are working in the United States. So we know that.
Yeah. No, I'm extremely bullish on Mexico. I think there's no reason why they can't become they'll never be, well, you never say never. They unlikely to ever be the economic superpower, but there's no reason why they can't be a top 5 contender. They have the biggest consumers in the world to their north. They themselves
Mm.
have the perfect geography for agriculture and for manufacturing. They've got the two popular oceans as their coastlines, nice deep harbors. Like there's 150 million people to work with, a terrific culture that rewards and values hard work. Like they have quite the run sheet for reasons to be bullish for them. The one thing is just that they're also at the border from the hungry northern neighbor, and they want to snort a lot of cocaine and take a lot of fentanyl. And as long as demand for these drugs exists,
that's
that
right.
scourge of Mexico is not going to be fixed.
They have, in a sense, too easy a time selling us these poisons.
No,
And
but it's so few of them that sell that
it's
sell
kind
it.
of,
That's the problem. If I'd
yeah,
be more
it
okay
is,
with
and
it if at
it's
least
such a,
like 20-30% of the economy could contribute. It's like a
yeah,
handful of people and a handful of towns.
yeah, in their spare time. Well,
Yeah.
the other thing is that I think going forward we have to become increasingly aware of climate issues and trying to de-emphasize the sheer kind of growth statistics that we've focused on in the past. I think from that standpoint, Mexico has a enormous potential to generate power, and through solar, wind, and geothermal. Uh, it's relied
Geothermal, especially.
probably probably too heavily on oil, but if it becomes an energy producer again using these other sustainable technologies, I think that's an alternative future that I hope that they're exploring. It's not clear that the drug industry is going to be that interested in it, but maybe there's some talent there that can apply itself to solar power and
Yeah.
just growing.
This is a question I asked James Robinson, co-author of Why Nations Fail. And since you're also, a Harvard economist, McKinsey chief economist, I'd love to see what your take is on this as well. When it comes to the drug trade, I said I don't know what you would say. What I said is that the demand here is a stronger force than supply. If they both have a measurement of 1, the demand 1 is going to win every single time, because implicitly it actually has a much higher value. Which is just to say that no matter what you try to do to stop the supply in the drug trade, which is criminalize the cartels further, criminalize the cocoa leaf farmers down in the Amazon, or criminalize the people in America who are taking it. Rather, no matter what you try to do to stop that supply, because the demand is a stronger force, they're always going to figure out a way to circumvent it. And truly, the one way to stop it is to reduce the demand, right?
Hmm.
Or to equalize.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that let's take the opium market, and Afghanistan is probably 90% of the world's opium supply. Various times it's enriched everybody there, including the Taliban. But it turns out that the United States never tried this. I ran it up the flagpole several times, but they couldn't get their head around it. Afghanistan opium supply, basically the entire farm gate value of the crop was about, last time I looked, it was about $1 billion to $2 billion. So the United States could have bought up the entire opium supply in Afghanistan and used policing powers to curtail alternative sources of supply or residual, but basically produce a huge legal painkiller industry that would have, been an alternative to OxyContin, probably a healthier one. And that would have entailed monopolizing, having the U.S. government become a monopolist of opium production, which was a little bit far for, I think, the U.S. authorities to accept as a policy alternative. But it was state action. It would have worked.
But because demand, what I'm suggesting is because demand is a stronger force than supply, that example of an intervention on the supply side would have been circumvented by just whether it's the Taliban or just a couple of more rural villages in Afghanistan going off and creating their own supply elsewhere, and therefore feeding whatever the more local demand is. I mean,
I think
it's not just
all,
the United States that is having opium, as it is also the case it's not just the United States having cocaine. This is also Europe and Australia and Asia.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, prohibition is not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about developing a competitive source of demand and a legal one that could generate jobs in the above ground economy. And so whether or not, the supply would have shifted elsewhere and adjusted, that's an interesting empirical question. I'm saying as a first hypothesis, the existing policies were not working. Suppressing the trade wasn't working.
Yeah.
Trying to get people to stop taking the stuff wasn't working. And so the idea that we would, sort of maybe do something productive with it and get people employed producing something else, was something we could have tried. Now, would that have been, would that have fixed people's appetites for drugs? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have stable work and you have more employment, whether that probably helps, deal with the demand for drugs. We don't observe, unlimited demand for illegal drugs. There are a lot of people who never take illegal drugs. We're basically left with sort of a menu of, imperfect policies. This one of monopolization and creating a legal sector industry, which is an alternative outlet for the opium, and then buying up is, basically saying you have to sell it to us, and if you don't, we'll deploy all of our law enforcement efforts to hunt you down. I think it's kind of hard to hide all the opium production, but anyway, that was my, I guess, rejoinder. I don't know about other experiments that have been done with other drugs and trying to get people off cocaine. It's not really or other drugs that I've
each drug has to be.
I think there's a lot of experience that suggests that the legalization of things like marijuana in Colorado and now New York, is problematic for the communities that are going down that path. There are a lot of critics of purely legalization that are suggesting that it creates
certainly
a lot of problems if you don't have medical care to provide for people.
I'm not sure if the answer would be just pure legalization, but I just make the point taking into account the fact that supply side intervention, for example, like salting giant swathes of the Amazon because this is where the cocoa leaf was originally planted.
That's ridiculous.
Let's just stop the production there and then it'll be fine. The next step, intervening on the flows into Mexico, failure. Intervening in the cartels in Mexico, obvious failure. Even if you succeed in bringing down a cartel, there's a vacuum that someone's just going to come and up the violence and up the depravity and just fill that gap. Because ultimately,
I think on
the
balance,
demand still goes north. And let's also now tie into this, like the talk of the issue of drugs or criminal organizations, tie into it your work and the work of Tax Justice Network, and make the point that it is tax secrecy and tax evasion and tax havens that allows the scale of these organizations. Because if the Sinaloa cartel couldn't hide billions and billions of US dollars through a couple of trusts in a Jersey bank, then they wouldn't have the means to scale to the heights that they do. And that also is a huge, massive component that isn't recognized when it comes to criminal organizations. Tax evasion makes it possible.
I think that's absolutely true. Money laundering is a national security problem. It's not just a drug problem.
100%.
It is, and it's not just offshore havens that are facilitating, and a lot of the money now is flowing onshore. One of the biggest loopholes is, the secrecy of U.S. real estate ownership. There's no registry of beneficial ownership of real estate in the United States. Companies and trusts. There's still no, it's as secret to have a Florida corporation as it is to have, a Jersey Isle corporation. So, there's a lot more that we should be aware of here, but a lot of the drug money has been flowing into, or kleptocratic money in general has been flowing right into the U.S. real estate market. It's kind of the new, now that we have more reporting on banks and bank accounts since the 1990s, people have started to use the real estate and to a tremendous degree. I mean, I just recently did a study of an island off the coast of Florida called Fisher Island, which is, just near Miami. And for the last 20 years, it's been used as kind of a laundromat for, sort of crooks from Eastern Europe who've turned up and bought and sold houses and properties there, and millions of dollars. Well, that kind of behavior is completely non-transparent. Florida, in many ways, is a financial secrecy jurisdiction when it comes to real estate transactions. So, undoubtedly, there's drug money in Florida. Florida has always been, they call it the capital of Venezuela. Miami is the capital of Venezuela. But, people don't want to invest their money in Panama. It's a tiny place. They want to have a real economy with real laws, protection. If, people go after you, you can actually count on an independent judiciary. That's hard to do in Panama. So I think that the irony is that we've created a sort of a split level system in which first world countries, let's take Germany, for example. Germany is widely regarded as a rule following, clean Western organization, sort of civilization with courts and elections and human rights. But it's also one of the key money laundering destinations in Europe. The Italian, various Italian mafias, Hezbollah, like to invest in Hamburg. Why is that? Well, nobody thinks of Hamburg as being a destination for drug money, but in fact it is. So, there's a lot of ironies here, sort of the fact that Western banks and law firms and accounting firms have created this infrastructure. It's now coming back to haunt us in the way that, a lot of the criminal activity in the world that's been mounting, globalization of organized crime, basically didn't exist when I started studying this stuff. It was, sort of localized or national. Now it's become truly transnational. So you see criminal gangs moving across borders, influencing elections, hacking elections, and
and a huge part of it is because they have access to the financial secrecy, which means they can maintain resources to use them as they see fit. And as we started with, it scales criminal organizations higher than they would be otherwise. And in the worst cases, just to see how this actually manifests in real life, it goes beyond, the buy and sell of a drug, right?
Mm-hmm.
It moves into human trafficking, right? It moves into gangsterism. Like it moves into it moves into different levels of crime, right?
Arms traffic, for example, global arms trade is enormous these days. We have all kinds of bad actors able to access, pretty serious weapons, and in many ways, the drug trafficking was the first installment of global organized crime. But I mean, now there's just, theft of intellectual property, the hacking that's going on, the serious sort of the big investments that organized crime is making on the margins, not in drugs. Those are fairly mature markets. They're looking at much larger, the ability to steal an entire company's, sort of customer list. And these are on the margin, the real, source. If you're in the criminal community these days, must be pretty exciting, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. I want to change the subject a little bit. Similar to the story of Balbina, the hydro dam, where that is just simply a case of a couple of key actors making boatloads of money by pretending to build this public infrastructure. Could you comment on debt trap diplomacy and the idea of a state actually doing this? For example, China investing a lot of money into some infrastructure project in Pakistan, whose actual productivity never really matters to them, because they just know that when Pakistan can't repay the loan, instead China will just say, don't worry about it, just let us have ownership of this area and we'll forgive the loan. The debt trap diplomacy idea. Could you comment on that?
Well, this is a model that China has been pursuing in some places, sort of. Um, I'm not sure to what extent it's widespread. I've seen that allegations about that kind of thing going on in Zimbabwe with respect to the diamond mines in Zimbabwe, and also in Angola, where China has made some investments. They like to have kind of vertically integrated enterprises. They've been buying up trucking companies in South Africa recently.
It's happening all along the New Silk Road for the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
Sri Lanka, Pakistan, all through.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. It sort of like reminds me of when Walt Disney built Disney World in Florida. He made a point of hiring Paul Helliwell, who we talked about before, to buy up all the properties around Disney World, because when he built Disney World and Disneyland in Los Angeles, he left a lot of money on the table because he didn't buy up all these adjacent properties, and they appreciated in value. So I think China is doing the same thing with front companies around the Belts and Roads Initiative, and they're probably not so concerned about the immediate profitability of some of the investments they're making. They're looking at these long-term kind of relationships that they're building, and they're sort of cultivating a local clientele who are going to be beholden to them, and favoring them. I do think that China has a certain amount of certain disadvantages in this game that they're trying to play, and we should probably be paying attention to those disadvantages at some level. But yeah, there's no question that they're for example, China has embarked on building something like 350 coal plants outside of China. I mean, so the last thing in the world we need right now are more coal plants, and yet China has undertaken the goal of providing its development partners with coal plants. Egypt and Kenya. So this is a sort of very questionable kind of investment that China is making. That's hard to justify from the standpoint of the climate or impact on climate, or even the profitability of the plant. But China has the technology for coal plants because that's what they know.
What do you make of the use of foreign aid today? Do you see it as a force for good or bad?
Well, first of all, it's a rounding error. If you take the total volume of remittances that are sent by very poor people from developing country back to their home countries, it's on the order of $700 billion a year.
Billion?
$billion a year.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
To, in comparison, the entire first world foreign aid budget is somewhere in the in the area of 130 to 140 billion dollars a year.
And I guess those remittances payments are going to be allocated much more efficiently than foreign aid.
Well, yeah, there are micropayments, $100 to $200 a month, and they're going to places like Haiti that are very, very poor. Philippines is a good example of a big remittance recipient. I think 1/5 of all Filipino workers are abroad.
Many in
like
Australia.
Guatemala. Yeah, and we have Guatemala. A lot of the people who are going over the border in Texas are doing so not because they love Texas, but they want to send money back to support relatives in their impoverished neighborhoods. So the failure of development has created these immigration flows, which has driven up the remittance flows, and that's another form of capital flight, human capital flight. Oddly enough, those people are paying taxes. The taxes they're paying are in the form of private rents that they're paying to players like Western Union and the bank cartels that partner with Western Union, sort of on the order of, well, it varies by country, but in the case of Mexico, it's about 5% of the $100 that you send to Mexico gets creamed off by the cartel. But, Citibank is a big player in that. But in the case of Haiti, after you account for the foreign exchange charge, you have to send in gourd, and then it has to be converted to dollars. It's more like 10 to 15%. So remittances, I would say, is a bigger issue for developing countries than foreign aid. If you eliminated the charges on remittances, sort of the excess charges on remittance, made it more like 1 to 2%, you would save at least half of the equivalent of half of the foreign aid budget. That would be going directly to the poor in these countries.
That's a really, really cool way of looking at it. Although then wouldn't it just then using the remittances loophole would become a way that people would take advantage of that by transacting money abroad as well?
These are second order problems.
Yeah, they're always going to be second, third,
regulating these things. One of the barriers to getting into the remittance business is the money laundering legislation. It's very expensive to become a bank. And so there's a trade-off here. We have to balance these different interests. But I think my balance would be in favor of the poor, because we've been given tens of $billions a year to Western Union.
Just because they're transacting
for decades, just because they're a cartel.
Yeah.
In Haiti, we have, a great example. We have 6 banks in Haiti that dominate the remittance market. Their partner is Western Union. I went with the World Bank to Haiti, 3 years ago, with $1 million. We had $1 million offer to change the remittance market, and the finance minister refused it. Why?
He makes a boatload of money.
His friends in the banks.
Yeah.
Bill Gates, after the earthquake in 2010, he had a great rush of altruism, and he decided he would solve the remittance problem in Haiti. And he put up $8.5 million with Digicel, the largest telecom provider in Haiti. And they designed an e-wallet that would go on people's cell phones. And, if you offer people $25 of free money on a cell phone, they will take it. However, after that ran out, Bill Gates and his foundation had done one thing, which was a mistake, which was, I don't know how much you've dealt with Microsoft over the years, but they are not noted for paying a whole lot of attention to the end users, as they call us, in terms of designing features in their software. Well, this is a perfect example. They didn't talk to a single Haitian when they designed this e-wallet, and the Haitians couldn't use the wallets to buy anything because none of the merchants could accept it. So they went back to using cash after spending, $8.5 million on this application. Any Haitian could have told
Only a
them.
smart person could do something so stupid.
That's right. That's right. He had to be Gates to be that stupid. That is a glaring example of sort of Western arrogance, I think. When it comes
I mean,
to this.
also, not to throw McKinsey under the bus, we'll throw BCG instead. But I mean,
Yeah.
there would have been some sort of Western consultancy firm involved in that.
Well, there probably was. I don't know if they were. They probably also had some locals involved, and Digicel was the. Digicel is this interesting company in the Caribbean. It has a big presence, and it's owned by an Irish guy. I don't know how that happened, but he's a good friend of Bill Clinton's, and they have the dominant cell phone service in Haiti and elsewhere. But anyway, they basically were very generous with their cell phones and all this. It's nothing to deny that they gave the money. It's just that they didn't use it very well, and they had this attitude.
This question cuts, I think, really to the heart of your work, Tax Justice Network work, Nick Shaxson's work, and it really is the ethics of tax evasion. Because I've tried thinking about this myself. I feel I don't earn a lot of money, right? But if I did, I know that there is a very, very, very strong part of me that would want to say, I don't want to give 50-60% of my money to this Swedish government, who I know is not going to allocate it according to my demands, not even to society's demands. It is largely going to be wasted. And I can accept some inefficiency in the system, but there is, I think, an egregious amount of inefficiency in how, say, the Swedish state allocates their funds, and they're one of the best in the world at doing it, which is just another way of saying, thinking about the ethics of tax evasion, as an individual, I have this overwhelming sense of I want to minimize as much as I possibly can the tax that I'm going to pay to the local government. So there's that question, the ethics there on the individual level. And then there is the ethics on the corporation level. This is now an organization who, take Amazon as an example, they were shopping around for their second headquarters. And it is actually a very good thing for your city. I mean, you would say on net, with all else being equal, it's a good thing for your city for Amazon to come in, because it's going to provide a lot of jobs, right? And providing a lot of jobs has a lot of down order effects, which are good for a local economy or a broader economy. And the trade-off is, well, we're not going to tax you as much because it's like it's the discount for you coming into our city, whatever. There's that level. And then there is where, like what Apple does, where they recognize their profits, which is just blatantly tax evasion. There's no ethical conundrum for this one. I buy an iPhone in Australia, yet for some reason that profit isn't recognized in Australia. It's recognized in Dublin because they're not going to tax their profits as highly. So could you, for me, look at those three individual examples, me as an income individual, me as a big multinational shopping around for a good place to put 10,000 workers, and then me as a big multinational just dodging all of my profitable taxes, the ethics of it?
Sure. I think that, let's break it down this way. First of all, these companies that we're talking about, in many cases, we also see them being monopolies or having market power that's transnational. They have been able to use this haven system to sort of game the system and to shift their intellectual property, for example, to places where they are citizens of nowhere for tax purposes. So they have, Apple for a long time was operating this subsidiary in Ireland that wasn't considered an Irish company because it had its management in California. It wasn't considered a U.S. company because it was basically, from the U.S. standpoint, incorporated in Ireland. So it was not taxed anywhere. It was a famous exchange between Senator and the Apple CFO saying, where are you guys resident for taxes? He said, well, actually, we're not resident anywhere for tax purposes. And they were transferring their intellectual property to this Irish entity and paying themselves royalties to that company.
And this is very clearly unethical. Like, there's no debate on that.
Tax-free, yeah. Well, from their standpoint, they take a narrow reading of what their fiduciary responsibility is to shareholders. And there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley, as enlightened as they are, they basically are more or less libertarians when it comes to the tax code. They say whatever works, whatever I can get away with, I will make better decisions about what to do with my money than Washington will. And so that's kind of a mentality that you have. They're not really acknowledging the fact that the entire technology industry in the United States was basically built on the backs of government enterprise, and that they've gotten enormous, not only in software industry, but also in the pharmaceutical industry, enormous intellectual property as a result of government subsidies. But anyway, that aside, I think the fundamental issue that you're on to is one that I've been after the tax justice movement to tackle for some time. I think we have some increasing experience that the taxes that are dedicated to specific uses that people can identify as valuable are more likely to be popular and to deserve respect than just the general revenue things that go into the atmosphere. And people are skeptical about government, and they've seen government being mismanaged in various ways, partly because of these interest groups that have their way with government and regulation. But let's take the example of what to do about the carbon emissions. If we had a carbon dividend that was not just a carbon tax, let's call it a carbon dividend, and we dedicate the revenue from that to giving ordinary people basically a royalty based on the fact that they own the atmosphere. We all own part of the air that's being used, and we have a claim on it. Then you'd see most people would actually get money back. And, even after paying the cost of their fossil fuels. On the other hand, gas prices would be higher, and oil prices would be higher. Coal prices would certainly be higher. And there would be, we would be pricing this otherwise free resource. We could tax this similarly. We could charge monopolies a kind of rent, recognizing that their pricing behavior is a form of taxation, given the fact that there is no easy alternative to buying some of the goods and services that a company like Apple sells. It's now a virtual sort of oligopoly, certainly. So the rents that they're extracting from everyone for that benefit is a form of taxation. We should be able to expect something back for that and limit the monopoly power. So I think the latest generation of Nick Shaxson's work, my work, is focusing on what to do about monopoly power. That's, I think, an important new theme. But there's no substitute for having citizens actually involved in government and making sure that they are taking their role as citizens seriously. So when it comes to making sure that local government is managed carefully and state government is managed carefully, and this is an ongoing problem, and a lot of people just don't take it that seriously. They don't see it as something that they need to be involved in. Someone else is going to take care of making sure the government is run well or is managed. It's going to look over the shoulder of the school board. I live in a community in Sag Harbour, New York, where the average student per year cost of the 990 students we have in the high school is something like $45,000 for public school. There are other communities in the same state where it's more like 5,000.
Right.
Probably the average is 8,000. But because of the way we fund education in this country, we're spending in Sag Harbour, the average student is going to school about 160 days a year. And so that breaks down to about $200 an hour per student for public education. I would gladly volunteer to take on 5 students and educate them to a Harvard level if they would allow me to do that. But I mean, that's just an example of sort of misspending. It's something that it's only citizens who get involved in understanding this stuff, and it's a lot of work. They say the problem with socialism is it takes too many nights and weekends. That's
too many meetings.
Been the case. Too many damn meetings.
Yeah.
And so you can't really. I mean, there's no, you know, at some level, you just want to say, come on, guys, let's just, stop blaming the tax evaders. There are people out there who are aggressive tax evaders and companies that are evading like crazy. And then there are the sort of mom and pop people who say, if I don't give it to the government, they're not going to miss it, and I'll have better uses for it than they will. Because look at these, the average cop in Sag Harbor gets $180,000 a year. So that's a lot of money for a
That's a
police officer.
well-compensated cop. He makes more than a lot of Scandinavian CEOs.
The last administrator, the last chief of police in Southampton Village, about 10 miles from me, just retired with $1 million pension. So
This is corruption, though, right? This isn't like this isn't a misallocation. This is
by people,
and this is why people
insiders.
look at the individual taxable income and say, I just don't agree that this man should have $1 million pension. I'm going to do my best to not give you money so you can give him $1 million pension.
Well, it feeds on itself, and I don't see an easy solution to it, but it starts at the top. It starts with having political leaders who are willing and able to say, to some extent, Joe Biden has been doing this, saying that this is the first president we've had who's talked about tax justice. His spending plan and his tax plan are in trouble right now in Congress because he only has 50 senators out of 100, and one of them is saying, I'm not going to go along with this. And there's sort of 11 Democrats out of the 220 in Congress that are, very conservative, and they don't want to pass his bill. But he is speaking out for the first time in decades about tax justice, about the fairness of, the super rich having $7 trillion more of wealth than they did before the pandemic. It's just a question of educating the public about what's going on, and getting them to, put down the fork and get them to be involved.
Let's do Russia, Jim. There was you wanted to speak about Russia. I'm very excited to hear what where you want to take that.
Yeah, well, I think that Russia is a great story of a missed opportunity, because at the end of the 90s, we had Putin restore to power, and 10 years before that, we had this enormous period of the triumph of the West, and liberalism was reigning, and the fall of the wall everywhere but China. By the way, we welcomed the Chinese dictatorship, but basically, in the case of Russia, we made this sort of Faustian bargain with very corrupt elements in Russia in the mid 90s. And I was there for this, and I saw it, and I was getting stories from people about the enormous transfers of wealth that were going on to this handful of people who were basically buying up the state sector. They privatized something like 150,000 state-owned companies that the Soviet government had, spent 70 years developing on the backs of the Russian people, for a grand total of $9.8 billion. That's it. And the oligarchs who came out of that period are still running the place and still very influential, although Putin, is controlling a lot of them behind the scenes. So I think I look at that period as one of enormous long-term impact and sort of a real failure of our sort of intervention there, and contrast it with the Philippines, where we and Japan, the case of MacArthur having a successful intervention. But Russia has turned out to haunt us. Basically, Putin is now being very influential all over Africa. He's been intervening in South Africa. He's been intervening. He tried to bribe the president of South Africa, Zuma, to build 8 nuclear power plants that they didn't need. We've had instances of his interfering in elections around the planet, including our own Trump case. And I think Putin is just a byproduct of this failed transition to democracy in Russia back in the 1990s. I think that's the main theme, and a similar kind of failed transition to democracy in China that we never even got off the ground. So I've looked at measures of capital flight from Russia and China, and those were by far, in the modern era, the modern version of this capital flight is that it has continued. And most recently, during the period from 2012 to 2018, those are record years for flight capital from Russia and from China. It's quieted down a bit now lately, but no question that these kleptocracies are equally capable of feeding the global beast.
You say it was a big opportunity missed to transition into democracy. I think there are many cases throughout the world, mostly in the Middle East, some Asian as well, that suggest that perhaps there is too much cultural baggage sometimes for a democratic model to just simply be transitioned into, China especially, but also Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, they went from the czars, where the leader of the state was literally a demigod, to the Soviet Union, where there was just zero trust in the state, zero trust in the state.
Yeah.
One cannot simply transition into then a democracy where they put faith in the state. In terms of the rise of the oligarchic wealth, I read Bill Browder's book, the former CEO of Hermitage Capital. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or his work.
Yes, I am. I know Browder.
Oh, you do? Well, that's fantastic. I
Well,
just thought his book was amazing.
He's a good example of I would characterize him as kind of a parasite who, sort of was quite happy to profit from this system while he could, and then he upset some people and he got on the wrong side. And his lawyer was murdered and that kind of thing. So he's now the big opponent of Putin. But I think it's sort of like, depending on the time of day and, the place, the leopard has different spots. But
Sure.
I
That was
don't
actually
take anything away from Bill Browder. I've met with him in London. He's very kind of quiet guy. He undoubtedly has done quite a bit of work to, sort of do what he can to expose Putin. But I think the bigger perspective is that it was people like Bill Browder who, at a certain point, were taking advantage of the Russian system instead of trying to see what we could do to support a democratic transition. I do think it's too much to summarize in one or two sentences, but there were pretty clear moments of decision that we made in the early 90s about whether to contribute more assistance to Democrats in Russia. And, my colleagues who were involved there, Jeffrey Sachs, are pretty articulate about the failures of U.S. policy to really ante up and put up kind of Marshall Plan type aid to facilitate that transaction. Both Clinton and Bush were concerned about being perceived as supporting communists, and that was a bad, I think, mistake. In retrospect, it was a tiny down payment on what might have been. So, but on the other basic thing, my big point today is that we've seen the global haven industry. I think a summary kind of comment on this is that we've seen 50 years of exposés. We have a kind of, I would say, fatigue with exposés. Panama Papers and the Bermuda Papers and all the Swiss papers and the Gates, Swiss Gates. It's what we're seeing now is democracy under threat all across the planet. We kind of assume that this neoliberal model of development in which everyone would have 1,000 flowers blooming would pay off, and yet you see South Africa is under threat. Brazilian democracy is under threat.
Brazil, certainly.
We have Kenya. The president is now trying to decide whether to run for a third term.
Yeah.
Their last election was hacked, not by Russians, but by Cambridge Analytica,
Mm-hmm.
and
Nigeria.
struggling,
Question.
developing democracies. So, and then we have Biden's recent decision to retreat from Afghanistan, which I think was um, about as poorly handled as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah, I would
But
say so.
the thing is that democracy is under threat here as well, and all of these institutional problems that we've talked about um, have had a cumulative effect. They have failed. They've failed to expand democracy anywhere. They have made it more fragile.
Mm.
And in every particular case, I mean, if I was going to write a sequel to Blood Bankers, I would write it about basically many of the same countries, because in every one, they're struggling to maintain the democratic progress that they've made. In some cases, they've gone backwards, like Venezuela and Nicaragua. Even Mexico. I don't know what's going to happen in Iraq. I can't believe it's going to be very positive, but Philippines is certainly experiencing a regression. Guatemala, I can't travel to. I can't travel to Honduras anymore. I can't go to Nicaragua. I wouldn't want to try to go back to Venezuela. Brazil is inaccessible. Most of these countries that I wrote about are off limits. So that's, for me, the saddest part of this story. It's the bitter ending. It's not just the global haven industry and the rise of all that. It's like the other side of it, which is what's happened to these societies that we failed to take care of.
Well, Bill, we can't end on that sour note. So I've got two questions for you. The first being, what is a country that you're extremely bullish on? These are questions I ask every guest, by the way. But what is a country you're extremely bullish on?
I like South Africa. I also like Iceland. Depending on the day of the week, I like the United States. I think we still have enormous positive contributions to the world. I mean, I think that we have achieving our country is an ongoing struggle. We have very deep-rooted problems, but we also have some great traditions to call on. But South Africa is a country that I've always enjoyed going to, and the people have wonderful sense of at their best, of South African as opposed to can't,
Mm-hmm.
and non-racialism, which I was talking about struggles at Amnesty that we had recently with, that kind of ideology of, whites being racist intrinsically, and, we have to, separate into tribes. That's, at its best, South Africa has opposed that. The ANC has opposed that. Mandela opposed it. And people on the ordinary people on the streets oppose it. They get along. They like each other. They relate to each other very well. So that's a country that I think is a bellwether. It's, if they stumble and go back into a kind of racial polarization, or some kind of violent civil war, that'll be the signal for the rest of us that things are really getting serious.
Mm. And
that's,
go on.
No, I was going to say Iceland is a little country that's kind of like it's fun. It's just kind of always entertaining. The music is crazy. The glaciers are maybe they're melting, maybe they're not. I mean, it's like everyone should go there and just visit, see what it's like. But I've always found Iceland kind of a positive experience. Anyway.
The final question, Jim, is it's a bit of a fun one. It's got nothing to do with taxes or anything. But it is, if you could witness a conversation or listen to a podcast between any two people, dead or alive from history, who would you want to listen to?
Oh, that's a probably impossible question to answer, but I'll take a shot at it. I'd love to hear a conversation between one of my favorite philosophers, William James, and probably one of the more interesting women on the planet sort of ever is a woman named Mother Jones. She lived to be in her 80s. She was involved in every major civil rights struggle and social struggle from really the 1830s on.
In America?
In America, she led the Colorado miners' strike, and in her 80s, marched up the hill. I mean, she had a profound commitment to keeping on and struggling. William James was a philosopher, but a pragmatist. He was really a very, I think, very positive force in American philosophy at a certain point in time, and emphasizing just the responsibility that we all have as citizens. He and John Dewey and others in that tradition, Richard Rorty, they're remarkable, pragmatic American philosophers, and they have that optimism that Mother Jones also had. So those are two that I would single out. I love my friend Ralph Nader. I talk to him all the time, and he's another force of nature, who keeps on in his late 80s, trying to make the world a better place. I'm interested in these people who manage through all of the incredible setbacks and difficulties that we face to keep on putting their shoulder to the wheel. That's really inspiring. So.
What a beautiful note to end on.
Good.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a whirlwind of a chat.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, the most important podcast I ever did, probably, I had to then defer to a free account on Zoom, which was just so frustrating. And because because we were recording on a free version of Zoom, it actually created a bit of anxiety for me during the chat, because when you record in Zoom with a free profile, there is no backup happening anywhere. So you run the risk of losing everything, even if there's just a lost internet connection, or when you stop recording, if your computer somehow just didn't manage to save this giant file. So it is very risky to record free on Zoom because there's no backup, and it requires everything to go well. Whereas in my other podcast software that I use, it will automatically back up as you're recording, and you could refresh the page 10 times and it would still have the recording up until that point. But anyway, it doesn't matter because we got it. We recorded close to 4 hours, and I actually chopped a bit of it off, hopefully to create a little bit more of a sense of narrative. But really, it was just unreal speaking with this guy. His work is incredible, and I have so much admiration for the investigative nature of the work that he was doing. This type of financial audit of international capital flight does such a good job at showing just how much corruption flows throughout all of the world, but then more specifically in some certain parts of the world. I realized while recording that it was too ambitious of a task to try and get the whole life story out in one podcast. I perhaps should have kept the confines narrow and focused on the scope of the book, but after I learned about his role as chief economist at McKinsey and all the rest, I got greedy, and I guess I just really wanted to know more. So go and buy Blood Bankers. It will, in addition to the consumption of Treasure Islands, really make you see the world differently, and also add a whole new flavor on what it is to actually handle billions and billions of dollars in foreign budgets and the rest. Because don't forget aid. is a giant part of this. And I really hope you enjoyed it. And unless you're incredibly masochistic, I suppose if you're still around to this point, you did enjoy it. But don't be shy. If you're still with me, throw 5 stars and a review into the podcast app you're listening from. And if you don't have a review functionality or you listen on some weird, obscure podcast app, open up Apple Podcasts and review it there, please. I cannot overstate how important that is for the discoverability of podcasts. And also, just finally, if you're interested in Nassim Taleb, I have a dedicated podcast to his work, the link to which you will find in the description. As well as if you've been listening to this on the Geopolitics and Power feed, check out my main podcast, A Curious Worldview. And also the final thing, go to my website and subscribe to the newsletter if you're keen. Otherwise, just go and look at the website. Maybe there's something interesting on there. Who knows? Maybe there isn't, but hopefully there is. And wow, that's a long one. That's all from me. Take it easy, you absolute legends. Ciao.